Sitting on Mickey's neck, Percy couldn't help but examine his familiar's body once more. More than 50% of it was made of ice by now, as the crow had suffered countless injuries over the last few months, some much more serious than others. By the bird's own admission, the wounds didn't hurt in the slightest, nor did the chunks of living mana that had replaced them feel all that different from flesh and blood. After overcoming the initial shock of seeing his body gradually turn into a frozen sculpture, Mickey had grown used to the changes. Thank Phoebe for that. I don't think his body will ever go back to the way it was. Not on its own, at least, Percy thought, flicking one of the pale feathers on his familiar's plumage and listening to the crisp ting as it bent under his fingernail. Well, more ice meant less hunger and stamina consumption, so they welcomed it with open wings. Sighing, he opened the pouch at his waist, tossing the now empty spatial amulets in with the rest. Dozens of them at this point, more space than he knew what to do with. Sadly, the devices couldn't be nested inside one another, nor stored in his seal, their overlapping effects forcing him to carry them like this. Taking a moment, he mentally tallied his total stash again, factoring in the newly looted elixirs. Curiously, most of the blues they'd killed over the past year had carried some, even the Orangeborns. Normally, this wouldn't have made much sense. Blue was the highest grade they could have ever hoped to reach in their lifetime, so continuing to cleanse their cores would have been a horrific waste of resources. The fact that their families had chosen to equip them with elixirs only spoke to their optimism that they would get their hands on some Aurora Dew one day. In other words, Percy was the reason these people had elixirs on them to start with, and he was now benefiting indirectly from his own influence on Remier. The exact amount each person carried varied, depending on how rich their family was. On average, Percy gained just over 3 months of unbrewed Aurora Dew for himself and his familiar from each group they took down. "Mickey, our stash has gone up to 17 years, he exclaimed. Most of the elixirs still had to be brewed, of course, but he was converting his stash faster than he was growing it, and he was growing it faster than they were drinking it. Percy had spent almost all his time working on the magical silk, with the occasional distraction every few days, whenever they had to fight or run from a group of blues. He'd only set aside a couple of hours per day for alchemy, yet he'd still managed to convert just over a third of their stash into Aurora Dew. At this rate, he'd be done in another year, though he might need Nesh's clone to top him up on secondary ingredients once he returned from Twilight City. That shouldn't take long now, since they were both getting close to his armor's upgrade. Regardless, Percy had already amassed enough spare Aurora Dew to deliver some to Sol the next time they met. Admittedly, he was starting to worry that she hadn't reached out yet, but he kept telling himself that she and Doe were more than strong enough to make it home safely. "If they keep throwing blues at us, we might not even need the wasp familiar," Mickey replied in a joking tone. Percy chuckled, though they both knew that wouldn't be the case. Leaving his promise to Nephthys and his own desires aside, Percy would need that wasp egg at some point. Their current situation just wasn't sustainable. Remier only had a few thousand blues in total, and only a tiny fraction would ever come after them. Most of the ones who would already had. As early as a few months back, Percy had noticed that the groups hunting them had grown rarer, especially the smaller ones. It wasn't until Nesha informed him of the increased bounties that more of them arrived in the region, most teams too strong for him and Mickey to take on. Percy had grown a lot stronger after fighting so many tough opponents. He'd taken advantage of every opportunity to weave his winding corridor technique more seamlessly into his fighting style, using it to freely engage or disengage his opponents at a speed they could hardly fathom. He'd also grown better at preparing and unleashing his thousand-fanged maw, as well as fighting alongside his familiar without getting in each other's way. That said, he still hadn't felt confident attacking a trio of blues, at least until a couple days ago. NW novel chapters are published on NovelUnderstood.net. The problem wasn't just the number of opponents, it was also the number of domains. On paper, the addition of a single extra mage would raise the difficulty by a relatively modest 50%. In practice, it was more like going from a 4 to a 9. Thankfully, one of his clones had returned with the answer, after being gone for half a year. Looking at Mickey again, Percy's gaze sank deep into the crow's channels, marveling at the fine, ink-like strands swirling chaotically within the bird's mana. It wasn't Percy's first time seeing this, but he was still amazed by how prevalent one's willpower was within the substance. Whistling in amusement, he couldn't help but pull up his status again, his heart skipping a beat as he read the most recent additions for the 100th time. Percy was already intimately familiar with the new entries, but he saw them in a new light after having experienced their effects in battle. Unauthorized use of content. If you find this story on Amazon, report the violation. Percival Avalon. Mana cores. Mana core 1, yellow soul. Mana core 2, yellow pure. Domain. Pulse, dormant. Bloodline. Clone, create a copy of yourself. Effect varies by affinity. Blessing. Blessing of permanence. Enhance the durability of your soul. Mutations. As Sovereign's Eye draws from the cumulative knowledge listed in the status to enhance one's vision, allowing them to discern details previously unseen. Spectral traits. Weaving boosts one's proclivity in manipulating one-dimensional structures. Insomnia eliminates the need for sleep. Spells. Wild art. Alchemist's intuition crude. A soul-to-soul, crude. A secret art. Soul harmony, refined. A frozen shards, refined. A soul conversion, refined. Spirit-forged cauldron, refined. A spectral art. Phantom scale regalia, masterful. Spectral art. Phantom spun silk, masterful. Wild art. Carnival of the savage gods, masterful. A hybrid art. Core bestowal, masterful. Alchemic principles. Extraction. Separate and condense an ingredient's essence. A pacification. Delay an ingredient's activation rate. Redirection. Adjust an ingredient's effect. A deattunement. Prevent multiple conflicting ingredients from reacting with one another. Bonding. Enrich an ingredient with crystallized pure mana. Restructuring. Alter an ingredient's phase. A scaling. Brew a greater volume of ingredients at once. Decrees. Phoebe's decree grants access to your status. Iapetus' decree grants a bloodline. Morai's decree grants a second mana core. Metatron's decree open a one-way portal to the vault of magic at will. EA's decree, modified, augments and enhances your status. Grants the Sovereign's Eye. Obatala's decree, modified, augments and enhances your status. Allows you to effortlessly deploy your domain in its strongest state. Sure enough, the decrees had completed their fusion without much trouble. Percy had repeatedly tried to manifest his willpower in the same way he'd done on Gallimus, without much success. That had proved once and for all that not only would he be unable to transfer the locked domain between bodies, but also that awakening even a nascent pulse like Dua's wouldn't be easy with just a couple of yellow cores. Not that he wouldn't try, but he wasn't in a hurry to waste his time with something that wouldn't make the slightest difference before his next promotion. Over a century from now. He should be able to unlock that power a lot sooner with his clones, while they possessed Mickey or Nesha, though he didn't see much of a point in that either. The so-called pulse wasn't very useful in combat, and his companions wouldn't benefit from it even after their advancement. It would be the clones owning the improved domains, not his friends. As for the clones, they might be able to manifest a stronger domain at blue, assuming they remained in Mickey or Nesha's bodies from green until the end of time, but their efforts would probably go to waste the moment Percy retrieved and replaced them with new clones. That didn't mean that his new decree was useless, however. Far from it. The mere addition of the domain section to his status had injected a ton of information into Percy's eyes, much more than the average spell or alchemic principle did. Percy likened it to when he first obtained the mutation, when the modified decree had forced him to keep his boosting art active for 3 days and nights, gradually fusing both his mana sense and soul vision into his eyesight. Unsurprisingly, something similar had happened again, upgrading the mutation into the Sovereign's Eye. Beyond the fancy name, which he didn't disapprove of at all, Percy could now perceive willpower directly. This was precisely what had allowed him to bridge the gap to the daring trio of blues that he and Mickey had slain earlier. His biggest issue when fighting such powerful opponents was dealing with their domains, the invisible sneak attacks that he struggled to predict, the oppressive pressure constantly bogging him and his constructs down, and the tight defenses that made it so much harder to land each hit. Well, it turned out that most of those problems could be solved, or at least severely mitigated by his new ability. Domains weren't uniform, especially when spread across a wide area. Upon close examination, they were riddled with flaws ripe for exploitation. Through them, Percy had swiftly identified the cleanest routes toward and away from his opponents, bypassing many of the negative effects acting on him and his sides. Following the flow of willpower had also let him predict the domain's movements, finally covering the most serious blind spot in his Greater Foresight spell. Even better, he now had a fourth channel of information to tap into alongside the shifts in his opponent's souls, the flares of their mana, and their physical movements, perfecting his glimpses of the future. I should still be more careful from now on though, he reminded himself. Despite his new advantage, 3 blues were still a lot for him and Mickey. The only reason they'd won so easily was their opponent's relative weakness. Recognizing the rival house's insignia and the common mana types they possessed, Percy had known not to expect a nasty bloodline or rare affinity. Even so, things might not have gone as smoothly if the youngest of their opponents hadn't been so inexperienced. The poor guy had probably only been a blue for a few months at most, not even knowing how to properly wield his domain. It was thanks to that, and Percy's decisiveness, that they had broken through their formation so quickly. Well, I don't regret it. That's one less family Galahad has to worry about. I doubt their patriarch will get any more funny ideas after this. Regardless, Percy was keenly aware that he'd have to grow even stronger if he wanted to deal with all those pesky trios of blues looking for them. And he should probably hurry up because their enemies would likely switch to groups of 4 once the rest of Remir heard about his latest victims. Luckily, he was about to do just that. Many of his and Mickey's projects were nearing their tipping points. Time to start incorporating the new affinities into our spells. Vast frozen plains stretched as far as the eye could see, jagged protrusions jutting out like icy fangs every mile or two. Nothing here was all that new to Percy. He'd traversed numerous frigid wastelands in the past, but he wasn't used to associating such vistas with his own world. This was Remir's North Pole. It was common knowledge that the singular supercontinent humanity called home stretched to cover both of the planet's poles, though he wasn't sure whether there was rock beneath the glaciers, or just more ice. Either way, it hadn't been his intention for him and Mickey to travel this far north. They had originally planned to stick to the wildlands between here and civilization, taking the time to hone their spells as they hunted down the occasional beast unlucky enough to cross their path. Sadly, their pursuers had been even more forceful than expected. Most of the groups searching for them were too powerful for Percy and Mickey to fight, meaning that they had to spend a lot of time avoiding them. They could still outrun most blues on Remir, so they didn't really have to worry about any lone team cornering them. But things hadn't gone as smoothly ever since their enemies started coordinating with one another. The smaller houses weren't interested in working together, as most of them wanted the bounties to themselves. The great houses, on the other hand, had let go of their pride at some point, probably realizing that they'd have to make some concessions if they wanted to succeed. Advancing in unison, they had methodically pushed Percy and Mickey farther and farther north, eventually forcing them all the way out here. And there was nowhere else to go, unless they decided to forego the safety of having land underneath them, or they started risking their lives against the tougher groups. It doesn't matter. We were planning to do that anyway. If those bastards think we're at the end of our rope, they've got another thing coming. Not that flying over the ocean would be a horrible choice. There wasn't any large landmass on the other side of Remir, but there were plenty of tiny, uninhabited islands. Percy and Mickey might be able to ditch their pursuers there, and maybe even grab a snack or two. Based on the relatively minor damage the red pyramid inside Percy's soul had sustained so far, they should still have over a year left before they were forced to infiltrate the spire. By then, they could grow a lot stronger, and it might even be worth going around the planet to invade from the south, to give themselves the element of surprise. It's something to consider. I could definitely use some peace and quiet when it's time to upgrade my armor. Percy had grown a lot faster at spinning the silk, but he would still need several days to prepare enough length. He'd need even more time to weave it into proper, enchanted clothing, and he'd rather not get distracted while doing it. Until the self-repair runes were in place, the material would degrade rapidly. But that was a problem, for later Nesh's clone wasn't even back yet. For now, they had bigger fish to fry. The frigid gales howling over the North Pole would have been deadly to a red, and quite unpleasant for even an orange. To Percy, they barely registered as a gentle summer breeze. He didn't just have his 2 yellow cores or Mickey's memories of Huey's dark side to thank for that either. It was hard to care about a relatively mild source of external cold, in the face of 3 networks full of volatile ice mana wreaking havoc inside his own body. Shivering, he helped the clone saturate every centimeter of his new channels with the soul-freezing ice the latter had prepared. In its corporeal state, the resource wasn't supposed to interact directly with his soul, yet Percy could swear that its insidious influence had somehow seeped through. Probably a good thing. If it's bothering me this much after working with it for so many months, my opponents are not going to have a good time. The clone had done most of the work on this project, figuring out how to fuse each of the 3 permutations of the ice, and using them to clear and temper the main body's channels. However, the last step would go a lot more smoothly if both of them participated, which was why Percy had taken a break from everything else. The idea behind it was simple. Between the 2 of them, 3 actually, including Mickey, they had all the tools they needed to prepare and equip themselves with their latest weapon. Yet, there was one hurdle that they still had to overcome. Supply. This chapter is updated by NovelFire.net. With the Carnival active, Percy tended to saturate his whole body with his original fused mana. This was okay in most circumstances, since it was simply more efficient. A compact resource that he could fuel all his spells and runes out of, capable of anything his individual affinities could do. In this situation, that wouldn't cut it. The clone didn't want Percy's fused mana. He needed plain old soul mana to fuse into the ice. The pure component would do nothing but get in the way. In theory, Percy could keep a portion of his mana unfused, to send to his companions. However, doing that would tip the delicate balance of power in his own body, leaving him with an equal amount of unfused pure mana that would just go to waste. Luckily, he already had the perfect solution for that. If you come across this story on Amazon, be aware that it has been stolen from Novelbin. Please report it. His old soul conversion spell. This was a spell Percy hadn't used in a long time. For the last decade or so, it had been gathering proverbial dust in some corner of his status, having fulfilled its original purpose, and never found a new one. Percy had first registered it as the crude self-bestowal spell, after studying the Vault's books on mana conversion. At the time, he had needed to get his hands on as much soul mana as possible, in order to attract his first spectral fiend to Remir. He had found himself in pretty much the same position as today, having a lot of spare pure mana and nothing to do with it. Unwilling to let it go to waste, he had resolved himself to convert, at least some of it, to soul mana, bolstering his stash during the operation. After practicing for months in Bogside Town, and getting a better feel for the natures of his affinities in the depths of the Grizzly Bog, Percy had slowly but steadily raised his conversion efficiency, eventually upgrading the spell to the refined tier. Sadly, he'd only used it once more since then. When his familiar was on the verge of starvation, Percy had demonstrated the spell to Mickey, teaching him how to convert his own air mana into beast mana. It had formed the foundation of the crow's regulation and, later, consumption, the bird's first masterful spell and current iteration of his boosting art that he almost always kept active. As for Percy, he just hadn't found any applications for it. While fighting, he was better off combining his mana types and working exclusively with the result. Situations where he needed one affinity more than the other simply didn't occur that often. And yet, here they were. "I'm ready if you are," the clone said, getting a nod back. They'd tried this before, but today they decided to go for the final push, to register the upgrade they knew was coming. The original began the process by activating his boosting art. Strictly speaking, the Carnival wasn't a requirement for the new spell to work, but the whole point was to figure out how to effectively manage all those disparate flows of mana, without impacting Percy's ability to fight. A few breaths later, Percy's body was full of his original fused mana. As a side note, he had finally decided to give the resource a proper name. It hadn't been an issue before, since he hadn't had as many different mana types to juggle, but things were starting to get quite confusing. Teal mana was no longer a suitable name ever since the blessing had altered its color, and fused mana wouldn't work either now that Percy had access to so many distinct flavors of affinity fusion. Taking a page from his own status, Percy had named it the Phantom Affinity, or Phantom Mana interchangeably. He knew it wasn't a true affinity because it couldn't form its own cores or channels, nor could it be found in nature. This was the main reason he had even resisted naming it for so long. Alas, such was life. Percy discarded all the soul-freezing ice inside his body, making space in his new channels for a refill. Holding his cores back a little, he prevented them from fusing all the pure and soul mana into phantom mana, leaving traces of the original resources to swirl around his body. Gathering the soul mana to his chest, he pushed it through the cord, but didn't stop there. He moved all the spare pure mana to his sternum, injecting it in his first core. Next, he used the organ to alter the resource's properties, converting part of it into a brand new source of soul mana. As early as when he and the clone had started working on this, he had noticed some positive side effects of his boosting art. Teaching himself how to circulate phantom mana through both cores had improved the organ's ability to handle the foreign concepts, inadvertently raising Percy's conversion efficiency, despite the fact that he hadn't used the corresponding spell in over a decade. Converting the cyan mana into its gray counterpart, Percy estimated that he had retained about a third of its volume, surpassing his previous best by a narrow margin. Good enough, he thought, sending an additional trickle to the clone. At the same time, a chilling sensation spread through him as a new flow entered his body via the second cord. There was barely any space in his soul channels, so he instantly moved the new resources into the other pathways he had emptied out earlier, turning them corporeal. For a while, neither he nor the clone did anything else, trying to iron out all the kinks in the process. Namely, they concentrated on keeping their boosting arts at close to full power, while going through the motions to restock their reserves of soul-freezing ice as quickly as possible. 10 minutes, Percy spat as soon as they were done, not feeling very happy about it. It wasn't a long time while idle, but it was an eternity in combat. Again? The clone asked. Percy responded by draining his channels and beginning the process anew. 8 minutes, he said the following morning, having repeated the experiment dozens of times overnight. As much as he wanted to keep going, he had already held the carnival active for too long. Percy had grown a lot better with it over the past year, but he still couldn't maintain it perpetually. Taking some rations out of his seal, he took a short break. He waited for Mickey to kill and eat an orange beast too, some kind of oversized polar bear. Still tired, he spent a couple of hours brewing some Aurora Dew, not the most relaxing activity, admittedly, but one that tired him in a different way. Only after he and his familiar had drunk their morning doses did he resume his efforts until noon. When it was time to drink their second set of elixirs for the day, they still needed about 8 minutes to replenish their stash, having not made as much progress. It wasn't until late in the following morning that they reached the next milestone, bringing the number down to 7 minutes. Percy's status had remained silent. 3 days later, they hit the 6-minute mark. Having grown a little more accustomed to the task, Percy could even imagine himself fighting while keeping the intricate exchange going, though he'd still have to offload some of the effort to the clone if the battle got very heated. Not satisfied, they kept going. Another week passed, their daily gains having slowed down to a crawl. Percy understood by now that they weren't going to get much better than this. He could only spare a little bit of space in his channels, after all. The conversion rate inside his first core had already plateaued, and the clone's ability to fuse the mana and send it back was also about as efficient as it was going to be. But Percy liked round numbers, so he pressed on until they reached a benchmark he could actually stomach. Just after the end of the second week, it finally happened. 5 minutes! His clone and Mickey cried out in unison, having shaved the last few pesky seconds off, and Percy's status rejoiced alongside them. Congratulations! Your spell has evolved. Soul Conversion, Refined - Secret Art. Mana Bargain, Refined. Save for a few key moments, Mickey hadn't participated as much in Percy or the clones' experiments with the new secret art. While Mickey had also learned how to fuse the soul mana into his ice, he'd prioritized other things with his time. Perched atop a frozen hill, he examined his wing, scrutinizing the glowing lines decorating his plumage. Having learned to circulate his ice mana, the non-soul-infused variants, inside all three of his networks, he had improved his boosting art slightly. Not enough to register an actual upgrade in his status, but enough to make a tangible difference during a fight. Says Noelfire.net. The air and water patterns on his body had lost their green and azure hues, shining in the same pale light as his original ice channels. The shape of the patterns hadn't changed, the mana still drew swirling gales and gentle waves as always. As for his ice and beast patterns, he hadn't touched them at all. The former lit up in an intricate hexagonal grid, its vertices forming intersections between the three elements, or rather, the solid, liquid, and gaseous states of the same element. Now, the beast pattern still resembled a network of amber lines synonymous with his circulatory system. His mutations converted his ice mana into beast mana at about the same rate as before. Overall, it wasn't a huge power-up, since Mickey didn't feel any stronger physically. However, he did have a higher quality fuel to pump into his spells. Had it not been for the additional sources of ice mana he'd tossed into his freezing tornado, he might not have pierced the Blues' defenses as easily a couple of weeks ago. This is just the start anyway. I'll grow much stronger once I add that into the spell. Now that his companions had finished working on Mana Bargain, Mickey was free to deactivate consumption. He still needed to keep it running for as long as possible to preserve his stamina, but he wouldn't be able to focus on his new project with it active. He knew Percy would have loved the chance to practice with the new tool some more, but that could wait. Taking a few deep breaths, he reactivated his boosting art, but not all of it. Ignoring the beast, ice and air mana entirely, he focused solely on his water channels. The wave-like patterns lit up again, this time in their original, azure color. Mickey didn't stop there. As soon as his channels were fully saturated, he expelled some mana from his body, letting it mix with the ambient mana in the air. Presiding over the external flow, he willed the loops to swiftly close into countless tiny bubbles floating leisurely, mere centimeters away from his feathers. Gradually, he pulled them closer, feeling them seep back into his body one after another, traveling a short distance along the wave-like patterns before getting ejected again. Every time that happened, they emerged smaller than before, containing less ambient mana and more of his own. Make them smaller and more consistent. The ones under your belly aren't moving fast enough. The ones on your back are traveling too far within your body. Push them out sooner, the clone coached him. The clone residing in Elaine's body had returned just over a month ago, bringing with him the complete knowledge of the water version of the dance. Sadly, Galahad hadn't had enough time to figure out the lightning or acid variants yet, but he had still shown Percy the corresponding circulation patterns. Not that he had much of a use for them at the moment, but expanding his library of patterns would make his life easier in the future, especially once he resumed sending clones to the vault. Thankfully, the situation in the Camelot province had calmed down now that everyone understood that neither Mickey nor Percy would be captured so easily. Most of the neighboring families had apparently decided to play it smart and not make any rash moves, which was exactly what Percy and Elaine had wanted to see. Either way, Mickey didn't care that much about House Avalon or Remir's political landscape. As long as his partner and their loved ones were okay, so was he. More than anything else, Mickey had been relieved to hear that Elaine had gotten her hand healed. He'd even asked Percy to keep the clone there for a while longer, to watch after her, instead of rushing back to pass him the technique. However, Percy had insisted that the best way to help her and everyone else would be to grow stronger. Thus, they had finally lost touch with Percy's relatives, gaining the perfect tutor from Mickey in exchange. This book is hosted on another platform. Read the official version and support the author's work. Percy had chosen to replace the clone in Mickey's body too. They had all dreaded that moment, because they hadn't known how easy it would be to recreate the convenient, two-way connection afforded to them by soul harmony. Were they to end up stuck with the much simpler cord they'd had in the past, It would have been a colossal loss, especially now that they'd finally grown better at using the empowered secret art. Unfortunately, it was a risk they couldn't have avoided forever. Sooner or later, Percy would have had to absorb the clone back. Not only because he didn't think his clones could survive forever on their own, but also because he needed to consolidate their gains to use his future clones more efficiently. Granted, the two had remained in touch over the past several months, but fusing had still been the easiest way for Percy to grow proficient with the soul-freezing ice, as well as the fastest way to teach Mickey the dance. Having his main body ponder over and consolidate all those distinct concepts under the influence of the wise man's murmurs couldn't be understated either. Luckily, their gamble had paid off. It turned out that recreating their intricate connection was just as easy as they had hoped. They had to use soul resonance to widen the two cords as the clone moved around Mickey's body to roll them up again. Once the connection resembled its previous shape, they only needed to cycle some soul mana through it and wait for it to settle. Thus, Mickey had gained a tutor. A few weeks ago, the new clone had started guiding him on upgrading the water version of the boosting art. Wrapping his mind around the masterful spell had still been a challenge for Mickey, but having somebody demonstrate the complete version in his own body had saved him a ton of time. This was very different from what Percy had done with Soul and Elaine. In both of those cases, Percy had been the student as much as the teacher, learning alongside them as they strove to perfect the spell. That was why he'd needed the help of an elemental source or over a year to complete those projects. Meanwhile, Mickey only needed to observe his friend for a while. Taking over once, he felt confident in maintaining the spell by himself. At the rate he was improving, Mickey would have likely perfected it weeks ago if they hadn't taken a break for Percy and the clone to work on Mana Bargain. "Don't get cocky now," the original Percy suddenly spoke. "Learning the water dance is just the first step. You still have to figure out the air and ice versions and then put everything together." Mickey nodded, knowing his friend was right. It would be tough but doable. They had 3 masters of the spell working together, Percy and the clone having even figured out a whopping 3 affinities by now. Still, they hoped Mickey would be done in the next year or so, which was bound to be difficult. Not that it would be the end of the world if they fell short, but the extra strength might make the difference between getting the wasp egg in time or not. For now, let's just get the first one down. Following the clone's instructions, Mickey adjusted the flow around his belly and backside, closely monitoring the size and the movement of the bubbles. The clone didn't say anything else, which probably meant that Mickey was doing all right. He held the boosting art active for half an hour before deciding to try flying. The distraction caused him to make a mistake or two, but the clone promptly corrected him each time. By sunset, Mickey felt a lot more confident that he could keep the spell active while fighting. Of course, he wouldn't actually try that because consumption was still better. Leaving aside the fact that it kept his hunger at bay, it utilized both of his cores and all 4 sets of channels, providing him and Percy with a better resource for their magic. It strengthened him more too. Regardless, this was a huge milestone. He could start dipping his talons into the other 2 elements as early as tomorrow. Content with his achievement, Mickey was about to let go of the spell when something unexpected happened. "Congratulations! You have mastered a new spell. Dance of the Savage Gods, masterful." Mickey stared at the deep red letters in shock. Percy hadn't taught him how to read, but Mickey could still understand the written language, thanks to his connection to Percy and the clone. More than the text itself, however, it was the implication behind it that left him speechless, for a while at least. "Percy, are you seeing this?" It was a rhetorical question. With soul harmony active, they could easily access each other's senses. They no longer even bothered to filter each other out as much, now that they had grown better at handling the information. And Mickey knew that Percy had been paying him extra attention today as he had worked on the spell. In fact, before his friend even got a chance to reply, Mickey noticed a second, similar message floating before Percy's eyes. "Congratulations! Your familiar has mastered a new spell. Dance of the Savage Gods, masterful." That confirmed that this wasn't just some random error that had occurred with Phoebe's decree. They hadn't expected anything of the sort, but the evidence was undeniable. Maybe this was related to some feature their status had inherited from Obatala's approval, or perhaps This was something it had figured out on its own during its latest calibration. Whatever the case was, one thing was for certain. Mickey could directly receive notifications now. Thinking he wouldn't be able to pour another drop of power into the spell, Percy finally let go. The gaseous portion of the soul-freezing ice he had compressed exploded soundlessly, propelling the object forward. The construct reached the blonde, middle-aged man in an instant, encountering no resistance as it phased through every obstacle in its path. Spinning rapidly, it left a trail of soul-freezing liquid behind it as it dug through the blue's defenses. The domain-infused wall of flames slowed the projectile down slightly, though it still sank into the man's tunic. Emerging out of his back, it kept going, disappearing into the darkness. No surprise there. Packing as much mana as 3 yellow cores, the spell was in some ways equivalent to a green's strongest attack. And that was without considering the unique properties it had inherited from the various mana types involved. The soul affinity not only allowed the spell to move several times faster than a corporeal construct would, but also made it much harder to detect and raised its lethality to a ridiculous level. Even so, a wound this narrow wouldn't have been enough to kill the blue. The surviving mage probably had no idea what had happened, but Percy had seen everything clearly. The man's soul had turned brittle after getting pierced by the attack, shattering like cheap glass, a result that could only be attributed to the ice affinity. The blue's eyes dimmed as he stumbled backwards, falling over the edge. His body plummeted down the cliff, Mickey diving after him. The crow barely snatched his meal just before it splashed into the dark waves crashing onto the glacier. Percy didn't pay the bird much attention, focusing on something else. Congratulations! Your spells have merged. Frozen Shards, Refined plus Secret Art. Mana Bargain, Refined-Secret Art. Soul-Crushing Needle, Masterful. Reading the notification, he couldn't help but smile. His Frozen Shard spell was something he hadn't even been able to use before. He had first registered the crude concussive blast on Felmara, using the air affinity he had borrowed from Leo. He'd upgraded it to Refined much later, while possessing his familiar. In both cases, it was his clones who had developed it, registering the only entry in his status that he didn't have the right mana type for. Thanks to their recent success with the soul-freezing ice, Percy had finally found a way to put the technique to good use. Of course, the original spell had heavily employed precasting, which wasn't fully applicable in this situation. The clone did use precasting while producing the liquid and gaseous variants of the fused mana, but other facets of the technique, like the rotations, weren't as firmly embedded into the mana and wouldn't survive the trip through the chords. Even so, the resulting spell had clearly been powerful and intricate enough to reach the next tier. Seeing that his remaining opponent showed no intention of attacking, Percy took a moment to ponder over the weaknesses of his new secret art. It was difficult to use, due to his lack of resistance to the affinity. He'd only managed because of his boosting art practically turning his body into a furnace, helping him fend off the cold. Despite this, Percy would be lucky if he could bear the frigid resource coursing through his channels more than twice or thrice in a short amount of time. The first activation only took 5 minutes to prepare, but subsequent shots would take progressively longer as he dealt with the aftereffects. Outside of the difficulties with the spell's preparation, it was also challenging to land. Percy wouldn't have hit his opponent if not for his eyes. They had helped him predict the man's movements and even allowed Percy to aim at a weakness in the domain. Had Percy shot the blue anywhere else, he might have failed to penetrate his defenses, even if he hadn't missed. In other words, the soul-crushing needle was certainly a potent weapon that could turn the tides of battle if used wisely, but it wasn't exactly the kind of guaranteed kill that Percy could fire without thinking. This story originates from a different website. Ensure the author gets the support they deserve by reading it there. Happy with his assessment, he shifted his gaze to the third and final mage. The blue had frozen in his tracks after seeing his companions die, probably realizing that the fight was over. He hadn't dared to move a muscle since, though his soul shuddered as soon as Percy's eyes landed on it. Mercy, I swear I will never come after you again. I'll tell the others in my family not to either, he begged, his voice quivering. His expression was downtrodden, probably not expecting Percy to agree. Suddenly, The giant silhouette of a bird shot up the cliff, a spatial amulet falling in Percy's outstretched hand. The ice splintered beneath Mickey's talons with a heavy crack as he landed nearby. Throwing his neck up, the crow flung what remained of the mutilated corpse in the air, swallowing it whole, clothes and everything, with a heavy gulp that sent a chill down even Percy's spine, let alone their opponents. "What do you think?" Percy asked out loud solely for the blue's sake. Mickey shrugged. "I don't need to eat a third blue core today. Do whatever you want." Percy sighed. Had this been 3 or 4 months ago, he wouldn't have even entertained the idea of leaving a survivor behind. These people had come after his and Mickey's heads willingly. And while he had indeed grown much stronger, it wasn't like he could start disregarding blues entirely or leave everyone he fought alive. What if this person joined the others chasing them? At the same time, the situation was a lot different now. Percy had initially wanted to keep his abilities hidden for as long as possible, to maintain the element of surprise. Sadly, that ship had already sailed. Some of the powerful teams that he and Mickey had been forced to escape from had seen their boosting arts and what the spells did to their bodies. They'd learned pretty much everything there was to know about their affinities and his constructs. In fact, Percy wouldn't be surprised if their enemies had pieced together that they didn't need to sleep, or that the runes he had engraved on his weapons hadn't originated from Remir. This person wouldn't even be the first survivor they left behind, though the previous cases hadn't been intentional. More than once, their pursuers had interrupted Percy before he finished off one of the weaker groups. It was safe to assume that most of their tricks were common knowledge by now. Of course, Percy would have preferred for his new secret art to not leak so soon, but he didn't feel like executing somebody in cold blood just to hide a single spell. "Leave your amulet. Don't let me see your face again." The blue didn't waste a moment, tossing the spatial device over before scurrying away in a manner not befitting of his grade. "I suppose we're at the end of our rope," Percy told the others through their connection. "Indeed," Mickey replied. They weren't as worried about the guy they just spared as they were about all the other groups closing in on them. It had been another 2 weeks since Mickey registered the dance, and they had been driven to the northernmost edge of the continent. Or was it the southernmost edge? They'd already left the pole behind them and crossed into the other hemisphere. That probably wasn't quite right either. There were plenty of shores south of here. Regardless, there was nowhere else to go other than the ocean, and the nearest blues would probably be reaching them in mere hours. In theory, Percy and Mickey could try slipping through the gaps in their formation, but that would risk getting surrounded. "I guess we're done here," the clone ultimately said. "With our latest upgrade, I feel a lot more confident killing groups of 3, but I doubt we'll be seeing many of those after today. Let's lay low for a few months," Mickey agreed, pointing toward the endless stretch of water with his beak. Naturally, they'd return when they felt more confident. Percy didn't think the blues would follow them into the sea. Even if they did, he and Mickey could just escape in pretty much any direction they wanted. They were bound to ditch the bastards sooner or later. Having prepared for this eventuality, Percy had already stocked up on dried rations engraved with preservation runes. They wouldn't last forever, but with so many otherwise empty spatial amulets, he had the next couple of months covered. Besides, he was confident they'd find the bare minimum of food they would need to survive, swimming close to the surface or living on the islands. If things grew too desperate, he could ask Nesha to send them more food with the clone when she was done. As a last resort, they could even risk it with some alien food from outside Remir. "I don't think it'll come to that. At least, Mickey can generate as much drinking water as we want." Leaving was probably the best option right now. It was about time for him to get his third trait and start working on the armor upgrade. Mickey had to focus on the dance. Climbing on his familiar's neck, Percy tossed one final glance at his surroundings, scanning the frigid wasteland they were leaving behind. Their small-minded enemies had chased them to the ends of Remir and beyond. And for what? New chapters are published on novelfire.net. Some money. An elixir recipe that Percy had always intended to share with them anyway. If only they waited a few more years or offered to pay a fair price for it instead of threatening him and his loved ones. Finally, to punish him for killing the Holy Children the First, a psychopath who had enslaved his friend for decades and massacred half a town over nothing, and the other someone dumb enough to help him. At the end of the day, their motivations didn't matter. Percy had no intention of getting captured, so his enemies would eventually have to let him be, one way or another. Mickey was flying leisurely a dozen meters above the surface of the water, the peaks of the hill-sized waves occasionally washing over his talons. Though the bird wasn't wasting his time, doing a bunch of things at once. Perhaps the most important one was working on his new boosting art. Only the green lines were currently decorating his plumage, as he focused on the air pattern of the dance. Long whirlpools of the same color extended out of his pores, resembling the original version of the technique that Percy had learned from Tlaloc. The ribbons certainly seemed to suit the air version of the spell better than burning wisps or floating bubbles. However, there were a few differences. The whirlpools were much longer, swirling around playfully, partly to capture as much air and ambient mana as possible, and partly because their very nature demanded it. Mickey was still at the early stages of developing the new spell, but, experienced as they were, Percy and the clone had done a decent job figuring out many of the key concepts unique to this affinity. Hopefully, it would save him a lot of time down the line. Sadly, Mickey couldn't keep the spell active constantly. He still had to alternate between that and consumption. Given the relative scarcity of food in their surroundings, it was the only way to hold his hunger at bay and preserve his stamina. That was also why he was scanning the sea for his next meal and keeping an eye out for enemies. Percy hadn't absorbed the new trait yet, because he wanted to make sure they weren't followed before he made the attempt. The last thing he needed was to end up surrounded by 4 powerful blues with blessings and bloodlines right when he was at his weakest. Thankfully, it had been weeks since they left the continent, and it didn't seem like anyone had bothered chasing. "We're probably safe. Let's stop on the next island we see," he said, eliciting a round of agreement from his companions. For now, he retracted his thoughts back to his own body, focusing on the task at hand. Ignoring the salty breeze colliding with his face, he stared at the thin mana thread intently. His fingers moved with otherworldly dexterity, adjusting and rolling the intricate ingredients that comprised his magical silk. If an outsider was to look at his hands, they might notice a thin, gray layer coating his palms. To Percy, the color appeared more pronounced. It wasn't mana. It was his soul, sticking close to the surface of his skin, even spilling outside here and there. It was denser near his fingertips, covered in lots of tiny appendices that resembled a spider's legs. Yet their joints bent in all the wrong directions. At first glance, the spectral limbs appeared to move erratically. On closer inspection, there was order hiding beneath the chaos, a faint rhythm to their movements as they brushed over the mana threads, working in tandem with Percy's conscious efforts to accelerate his production. Before registering the spell, he hadn't been able to manipulate the fine materials this easily. He had designed the ingredients in such a way that they could latch onto one another with minimal input from him. The hook-like grains were meant to interlock into a grid around the central thread, while the rest of the materials would coat the sheet that wrapped around it. Percy had even developed specialized techniques to mass-produce these materials without having to forge each crystal separately. Upgrading reinforcement into the masterful spectral art had changed everything. Percy could now clearly perceive everything going on between his fingers. He'd also learned to cooperate with the weaving trait seamlessly after months of arduous practice. He could produce the materials in real time, rolling them up into coherent and flawless strings several times faster. Keeping at it for several hours, he hadn't glanced even once at the bluish-gray strand fluttering for dozens, if not hundreds of meters behind him. It was growing by just over a finger's length per second, or roughly the crow's wingspan per minute. At this rate, Percy could produce enough for his project in a couple of weeks, a massive improvement compared to when he'd just started. If he got lucky, the silk might even survive that long without degrading. Stolen from its rightful author, this tale is not meant to be on Amazon. Report any sightings. However, that still wasn't enough. Spinning the silk wouldn't be the end. He'd also have to weave it into an enchanted fabric and shape it into something he could wear. That was bound to be a time-consuming process in and of itself, as well as one that he hadn't had the chance to practice as much. "I suppose I have enough silk to do some test runs now," Just as he was trying to decide whether to keep spinning or to switch to runecrafting, a gray wisp slammed into his body, sinking into a hole in his soul located on his right shoulder. The collision itself only rattled him for a moment, but the influx of memories was more annoying to deal with. He sighed. Time for a break. Now that Dua and Elaine's clones had returned from their long assignments, Percy had a total of 3 wisps on constant rotation. In theory, having so many clones actively searching for opportunities was a good thing, but it did mean he had to deal with multiple interruptions per day. Percy had grown a lot better at handling the clones, even when they arrived at an inconvenient time, such as while he was working on something mentally intensive or during a dangerous fight. If he wanted, he could ignore the clone entirely and keep spinning his silk. But he'd have to create a new clone sooner or later, so there was no sense in delaying the inevitable. Summoning a broken piece of his scythe's shaft from his spatial seal, he wrapped the silk tightly around it before storing it away. He could try to weave some enchantments with it at some point. Next, he spent a minute to fill up another wisp with phantom mana, before using his bloodline ability to sever the bloated orb from his soul and watching it shoot away into the unknown. Finally, he emptied 2 vials of Aurora Dew directly into his stomach, using his whirlpool of 4 streams technique to cleanse his cores. Strictly speaking, Percy didn't have to use the modified version of the technique anymore. Now that he could passively fuse his affinities and circulate the phantom mana directly through both cores, 2 streams would suffice. By turning them corporeal, he could have them churn the contents of his stomach, mixing with the elixirs. Then, he could turn one of them ethereal and pull each to a different core. But there wasn't any point. Percy had already grown extremely familiar with the art after using it thrice a day for nearly 2 decades. It was an integral part of his routine, effortless and lossless, and he didn't see a reason to go through the hassle of changing his habits. Other than clone creation and core cleansing, Percy had cut out all the other distractions from his schedule, so that he could focus exclusively, or as close to that as he could get, on the silk. He'd even stopped brewing. Percy wasn't in a rush to convert the rest of his stash, because he'd already prepared enough Aurora Dew for the next 7 years. Even if he excluded the portion he was planning to give Soul, he and Mickey would be okay for a long time. Besides, brewing would be wasteful right now, with so many upgrades on the horizon. In the process of replacing his armor, Percy would inevitably improve greatly at runecrafting, which should allow him to upgrade his cauldron too. A bigger and finer cauldron would not only let him brew even more elixirs at once, but also raise his yield again. On top of that, there was the compression principle that he had yet to register. He still wasn't sure that the strange plant he'd brought from Golimus contained gravity mana, but he did know that Nesha and the clone had already bought a bunch of other ingredients for him. Besides making his potions and tattoos usable again, the new entry would hopefully boost his yield even more. Everything considered, holding on to the elixirs was the smart choice for now. Percy would get more value out of his stash if he played his cards right, and he wouldn't even have to waste as much time and effort to convert it. All in due time. For now, the priority is the spectral trait. Mickey, can you stop on that island? They'd waited long enough to be relatively sure that they were alone in the region. Even if they got attacked while he was vulnerable, the crow should be able to grab him and fly away. The safest option might have been to attract the fiend while sitting on his familiar's back, but Percy didn't think that would work. Saturating his surroundings with mana to lure the creatures over was a big part of the operation. Obviously, he wouldn't be able to do that while moving. Following his instructions, the bird descended upon the island. It really was just a rocky protrusion sticking out of the water, its sharp tip piercing through the surface of the ocean like a colossal caveman's spear. Dropping Percy off on a somewhat flat spot by the boulder's side, Mickey took off, patrolling their surroundings for potential threats. Pushing his boosting art to its limits, Percy commenced the familiar procedure for what he hoped would be the last time. Inflicting a series of small incisions on his soul, he poured the mana out of his injuries, lacing it with thoughts of fear, injury, and death. Internally, he was a lot more excited than he showed, however. Fingers crossed for a good one. Waves hurled themselves against the rocks below, each one breaking apart in a crash of white foam. Just beyond the spray, Percy sat cross-legged at the cliff's edge. If he'd let his legs dangle, the sea would have washed over his feet every second or third wave. As it was, only the cool mist reached him, sharp bursts of brine that salted his lips and left crusted traces in his hair. He ignored that, as well as the irritating sting of the numerous cuts still marring his soul, and the dense gray fog surrounding him. Should I switch back to phantom mana? He'd used soul conversion again, turning all his pure mana into soul mana in the hopes of maximizing his output. Had he stuck with the fused resource, the volume would have decreased, but the fiends might have found the gourmet meal more appealing or something. Unable to decide, Percy had alternated between the two types of mana with each fresh attempt. He and Mickey had stayed here for a couple days already, Percy having tried to lure the creature several times, without much success. He shook his head. No, this is fine. It worked for me the first time, didn't it? I just need to be patient. Some failures were only to be expected, really. They weren't in the Thirsty Valley anymore, so Percy's output was back to a 20th of what it used to be under the influence of Kronos' decree. On top of that, Mickey didn't have access to any powerful souls to break down for him. In some ways, Percy was even less prepared for this attempt than he'd been in the Grizzly Bog. Sure, his grade was higher and his boosting art stronger, so he wasn't as worried that the creature would elude him forever, but he understood it might take a few more tries. Sighing, he began the process anew. You seem to be looking forward to your new trait, Zoras suddenly said, causing Percy to raise an eyebrow. The god rarely spoke unprompted, often remaining silent for entire weeks or even months. Sometimes, Percy almost forgot that he had such an ancient entity wrapped around his finger. Not that he was very surprised by the god's behavior. Deities lived for eons, to them. A few months passed in the blink of an eye. This was especially the case for Zoras, who had spent Phoebe knew how long in isolation, never interacting with another soul. Shouldn't I be? Percy asked back. The other two have served me well so far. Well, you should. But I don't think you appreciate just how painful absorbing it is going to be. I've seen people give up halfway through the procedure, deciding that 2 traits were enough for them, after all. Percy chuckled, thinking the god was joking. But Zoras wasn't laughing. Wait, you're serious? Are you telling me there are genuinely people out there who would let this opportunity go to waste just to avoid hurting for a few minutes? Like I said, I don't think you fully appreciate just how painful this is going to be. Having 3 fiends wreaking havoc inside your soul is very different from just 2. Percy swallowed hard, choosing to believe Zoras. Of all the painful things he had endured over the years, absorbing his second fiend had easily topped the list. If the former god insisted this would be even worse, Percy didn't doubt it. Still, he wasn't going to back down. Is it definitely safe? Percy asked. It is. Either you grit your teeth and make it to the end, getting your 3rd trait, or you pass out from the pain and have to start over. At least, I've never seen anyone with the blessing get permanently injured from just 3 fiends. Don't even think about getting a 4th, though. Percy nodded, latching onto something the god had said. Stolen story. Please report. You speak as if you've seen many people with multiple traits. But soul affinities should be rare outside Melodia, and the Melodians don't have any gods or blessings. The former god sent him the mental equivalent of a shrug. I've lived for a very long time and traveled far. Soul users are rare, but they exist. Not many make it to godhood, yet the ones who do will often sire hundreds or even thousands of kids. Inevitably, a few of them inherit both the affinity and the concept. Zoras' words only made Percy more curious, but he held himself back, thinking that what he wanted to ask might be too personal. Noticing his unease, the god chuckled. You don't need to walk on eggshells around me, Percy. My skin is thicker than most, he joked. To answer your unspoken question, I've fathered plenty of kids myself. So many, in fact, that I never even bothered to count them. I've personally guided some of the most promising ones into obtaining their traits. He added, his voice trailing off. Zoras sighed before continuing. You know, I hadn't given this much thought before meeting you, but I now realize that I wasn't a good father. How so? Percy asked just to be polite, though the answer was abundantly clear, given how the former god had even talked about his children. I didn't mistreat them, but I did disregard them, or even neglect them. At least the ones I didn't see as talented. Not that you aren't plenty gifted yourself, but spending so much time with you reminded me that I never did that with my kids. I didn't ask them about their dreams or aspirations. I never bothered to, be a father to them. Hearing the sorrow in the god's voice, Percy wasn't sure how to console him. Do you think any of them might still be around? No. My world was only a lesser spring, and none of my children was a greenborn. We did have a few friends among the greater springs, but they tend to be quite tight-lipped about their secrets, especially the ones pertaining to their faster advancement speed. What about their descendants? Percy asked. One of your great-great-great-grandkids might have made it to godhood or something. Maybe your world became a greater spring after you left. My world was destroyed, Percy, long before I got turned into a ring. Oh, indeed. Zoras mentally shook his head. You don't have to cheer me up. These are things I've already made peace with. I do wish I could go back in time and do things differently. I've written so many of my red-born and orange-born children off without even giving them a chance. I only saw my sons and daughters as potential assets, loyal people that could strengthen my world. I judged them based on things they couldn't control, such as their birth grades or their affinities, and look at me now. I'm a ring. I'm stuck at an even lower starting point than any of them, yet I haven't given up on myself, despite having been so quick to abandon my children. Feeling the gods' guilt through their connection, Percy knew there was nothing either of them could do about that. The man's family was long gone, so he wouldn't even be able to apologize to them. Left with no other choice, Percy tried to change the topic. Do all the large factions know about spectral traits? Some do. Since soul users only make up a tiny fraction of the population, there aren't as many people experimenting with such obscure uses of the affinity. Even fewer would do something as crazy as trapping a fiend in their core and grinding it down. But someone did discover this at some point, and the secret eventually spread through wars, trades, and espionage. All of this happened before I was born. Mind you, Percy frowned, noticing a discrepancy. There are hundreds of greater springs that have managed to hold on to the secrets of their advancement, but they couldn't keep the information about the spectral traits to themselves? It's not the same. The former is the kind of thing that elevates the entire world, allowing them to produce more gods. It's the very key to their power and status, so they can't afford to leak it. The latter is something that only a sliver of the population cares about, soul affinity users. Rather than thinking about their planet, they are better off banding with other soul users across the universe and working together to develop new techniques to give them an edge over their rivals. The scope of the secret is different, as are the motivations around guarding it. Did nobody ever find a way for people without a soul affinity to absorb a fiend? Percy asked. This was something that had been bothering him. He would have loved a method to grant Nesha, Elaine, and Mickey their own traits. Right now, they only shared Percy's, and only as long as his clones inhabited their bodies. I don't think it's possible. Having a soul core is paramount because the way you absorb the fiend is related to the way the organ converts ambient mana into your own, but also to the resistance to your own mana type that it grants you. I know you are used to achieving the impossible, but I wouldn't risk experimenting with your friends' lives if I was in your shoes. Percy fell silent, contemplating the god's words, though he didn't get the chance to think about them for too long. A silver object glinted in the distance, its faint glow barely piercing through the dull gray fog surrounding Percy as his lips curled upwards. It was finally here, his third spectral fiend. Writhing atop the jagged stone platform, Percy clung desperately to the rock, trying to keep himself from sliding into the sea below. His nails split and his palms tore under the pressure of his grasp, blood mixing with the salty spray. But the sting on his hands was ultimately nothing, a mere tickle, compared to the agony ravaging his soul from within. Zoras wasn't kidding about this. The second trait had indeed hurt a lot. But this belonged to a different category of suffering altogether. First, everything had seemed manageable. The fiend had been small and round, just compact enough to fit inside his core with ease. Even if it had been larger, Percy was certain he could have forced it in. Its carapace had been glossy but not smooth, covered in etched markings, otherworldly symbols that had defied comprehension. Stranger still, the engravings hadn't been static. They'd kept shifting at irregular intervals, pulsing in and out of existence like some maddening poem too wrong for a mortal's brain to comprehend. Percy hadn't wasted a second before beginning the process of grinding the creature down, disseminating its remains along his soul. He hadn't even stopped to ask Zorez what the trait actually did, because it didn't really matter. Whatever ability the fiend was about to grant him, he wanted it. And the sooner he got through the torture, the better. Or so he'd thought. As soon as the ever-shifting symbols had appeared on the surface of his soul, his existing traits had reacted with violent hostility. The spider-like limbs of the Argalios and the long, flowing hairs of the Nictovios had sprouted like weeds, lashing out in fury. The limbs had stabbed inward, clawing at the tainted regions of Percy's soul, trying to peel them away like infected scabs, more than happy to flay him alive to destroy the intruder if they had to. Meanwhile, the silken hairs had coiled tightly around the crumbling flakes, trying to yank the symbols out before they took root. The engravings hadn't taken this without a fight either. Whenever the older traits had succeeded in shaving away a marked layer of his soul, the symbols had formed themselves again on the next one, stubbornly etching themselves even deeper. Worse still, they'd forcibly rearranged Percy's soul's cape in the process, shoving the limbs and the hairs aside. That had only enraged the older traits further, however. In their fury, they'd even turned on one another, the tentative truce they'd reached and maintained over the past year all but forgotten. Each of the three traits had fought against the other two in a complete free-for-all, turning Percy's soul into a battlefield. The chaos hadn't stopped at the edge of his vision either. Percy had felt the battle raging beneath the surface, stretching to the deepest recesses of his soul. Gritting his teeth, Percy cried out to his familiar, "Mickey, pin me down before I fall in the water." He didn't get a reply, at least not immediately. Then, he heard it, a splash, loud and sudden. Percy twisted his head in the direction of the noise just in time to see a great bloom of white foam erupt in the distance. A massive beak broke through the surface a moment later, Mickey gasping for air. "Can you stop this?" The clone snapped, irritation cutting through the cord. "You're sending us your pain." Percy blinked. He hadn't even realized. Unconsciously, he'd used the connections as an outlet, flooding them with raw emotion. Sure enough, another surge of protest arrived from Nesh's end. Damn it! Forcing himself to clamp down, Percy sealed away his broadcasted anguish, thanking the gods his other three clones were currently away from Remir, well outside his range. There was no reason to ruin their day too, especially since they'd all bring him the memories back eventually, forcing him to relive this hell another 5 times. Enjoying this book? Seek out the original to ensure the author gets credit. Percy watched his familiar freeze a lump of ice into his surroundings before using it to climb out of the water. Percy sure hoped they wouldn't get attacked in the next few minutes, or they'd be sitting ducks. Left with no other choice, he did his best to hang onto the cliff by himself as he turned his senses inward, accelerating the fiend's disintegration. At this point, it wasn't even about the trait anymore. He just wanted this to end. And he had to succeed because he really didn't feel like starting over. This was torment he wouldn't even wish on his worst enemy. Acton and Raziel's faces popped up in his mind. On second thought, maybe I would. Before he could spiral deeper into his delirium, the world began to whiten at the edges, his vision blurring as his thoughts scattered like leaves in the wind. No, I have to stay awake. Percy used the pain to slap himself back to his senses. "Percy, focus on my voice," Zorez said, his calm words echoing through Percy's soul. "Stop thinking about the pain. Let's talk about something else, anything else." "Easy for you to say. You're not the one being eaten alive." Percy resisted the urge to swear, reminding himself that the former god was only trying to help. And to be fair, Zorez had warned him. "Think about the trait you're going to get," the god urged. "I promise it's a useful one. Especially for you." You recognized it? Percy forced himself to ask. Though he still found it hard to be excited. Any trace of his boiling passion was buried beneath his grief. Right now, all he wanted was to spit the half-absorbed demon out of its core and disappear. Ignoring the edge in Percy's response, the god nodded. The fiend is called a Cymbeline. It will help you with runecrafting. This time, Percy's ears perked up. Clearly noticing that, Zoras chuckled before elaborating. It'll help you with the grunt work. You will be able to draw even the most intricate symbols as easily as breathing. It doesn't even matter what tools or medium you use. Ink, paint, chalk, carvings. It applies to any kind of writing. But it won't help you express meaning into your enchantments. Visualizing their effects is something you'll still have to do by yourself. Hearing that, Percy's feelings were mixed. On one hand, this was excellent timing, since he was planning to shift his attention to runecrafting for the foreseeable future, and any edge would help. In some ways, this was his luckiest trait yet. Not that he was dissatisfied with weaving or insomnia, but their effects had been pretty random by comparison, especially the first one. Finding applications for it had taken him a while. On the other hand, he couldn't help but feel a little underwhelmed. It sounded like the new trait's effect was somewhat modest. Drawing the runes was only a small part of the craft. Visualizing their effects was the real challenge, especially once he delved into more complex enchantments involving multiple runes. It could have been worse. I get to have 3 different and usable traits. That's more than most people can say. Percy still hoped the trait would be worth all this pain, though. Suddenly, he found some newfound respect for those people who stopped after their second trait. Perhaps they weren't as lazy as he'd initially assumed. The war within his soul dragged on for several more agonizing minutes. The ghostly appendages cannibalized one another with wild abandon, while thin, glowing cracks webbed across the gray flame inside him. They reminded Percy of the early injuries he had endured as a teenager back when he'd misused his bloodline. That said, this was a lot different. The cracks were much shallower, less life-threatening. Percy didn't think his soul was in any danger of falling apart entirely and killing him. He probably had his blessing to thank for that. Shallow as they were, the cracks were still more numerous, however. They densely permeated his soul from head to toe, making every moment excruciating. By the time the process ended, Percy was a wreck. His traits had finally receded into dormancy, leaving behind a battered husk. His soul throbbed and burned, his body shaking with exhaustion. He sure hoped that none of his clones returned in the next few hours, since he wasn't in any condition to deal with them. Blood and sweat soaked his tattered clothes, still oozing from the countless tiny cuts his spasming had inflicted. He didn't even have the strength to celebrate what he could only describe as his greatest victory to date. Thankfully, his status did that for him. Congratulations! You have absorbed a new spectral trait. Scribing. Percy struggled to raise an eyebrow, too tired to be surprised. What the hell? That's new. His previous traits hadn't triggered notifications. In fact, very few things did. Originally, his status had only acknowledged new spells, adding alchemic principles to the list after Atlantis. Evidently, its latest upgrade had done more than just extend its features to Mickey. Winning over his exhaustion, his curiosity prompted him to pull up the whole thing, his eyes landing onto the new entry. Undersir. Ascribing boosts one's proclivity in expressing meaning onto any written medium. Whenever Percy powered up, be it through a trait, a mutation, or a spell, he was usually eager to explore his new limits. Not this time. After gulping down a few healing potions to patch up the scratches on his skin and relieve the worst of his fatigue, he took a break for a couple of days. This was one of those rare moments when he genuinely wished he could still sleep. It wouldn't have accelerated his recovery or anything. The whole point of the insomnia trait was that it gave him the benefits of resting while awake. Yet, sleep would have helped him ignore the lingering ache in his soul. Alas, he'd never bothered learning how to overcome the trait's influence. Worse still, his missing clones returned one by one during his downtime, each drop kicking new memories into his already throbbing mind and exacerbating the damage to his soul. Percy wasn't in a rush to replace them either, opting to give himself a chance to fully recover first. His sanity demanded it. The silver lining? Mickey had fared a lot better. Leaving aside his short-lived flying accident, the Crow hadn't had much trouble hauling Percy on his back and resuming their travels mere minutes after the operation. Not that it mattered even after everything. They'd yet to spot any sign of their enemies. It wasn't until a week later that Percy finally felt ready to test his new capabilities. After drinking his morning doses of Aurora Dew and deploying a fresh trio of clones on interstellar expeditions, he paused for a moment to admire the sunrise. This wasn't the kind of view people on Remir got to see often, so Percy tried to claim small victories like this whenever he could. Light spilled over the ocean, painting the horizon in vibrant hues that bled sky into water. Being on the run has its perks, doesn't it? He asked with a chuckle. Sure does, Mickey replied, gleefully scooping up a large fish dumb enough to swim close to the surface. They didn't know what it was called, but it was a decent catch. The poor creature was large enough that it barely fit inside Mickey's oversized talon. It squirmed desperately, trying to break free from the Crow's iron grip. Its red core wouldn't do much for the familiar, but it did pack a lot of meat. It would make for a fine breakfast even shared between them. Not feeling like eating dried rations today, Percy took a few minutes to grill his portion on a construct adorned with heating enchantments. As for Mickey, he was more than happy to eat the fish raw. Once they were done sharing the peaceful meal, the Crow resumed working on his boosting art, as Percy finally took a gray slab from his spatial seal. He'd forged the reinforced construct before acquiring his blessing, but the material had subtly changed colors over time, darkening after repeatedly drinking his phantom mana during its maintenance. Let's start simple. I can play with the silk later, assuming it's even survived the past week, he thought, scratching the back of his head. Not wasting any more time, he gathered some mana to his finger, carving a concealment rune into the slab's smooth surface. Percy was rusty. He hadn't focused on runecrafting that much over the past few months. Still, his current task was easy enough that he completed it without issue, and without noticing any changes to his soul. Try something a little more challenging, Zoras advised. The trait won't show itself if you're just messing around. Nodding, Percy poured his mana into the self-repair enchantment on the back of his trusty learning aid, rapidly erasing the concealment rune on the front. Then, he decided to draw a different symbol, this time going for one of the most intricate pseudo-enchantments he'd carved onto his armor. That was when it happened. The moment he pictured the elaborate shape in his mind and pressed his finger against the slab, he felt his soul squirm. His hand moved by itself, carving the complicated symbol with unnatural precision. Even better, mana seemed to gush out of his cores on its own, mixing and providing a steady flow of ink for his finger to work with. Realizing that the process didn't require any conscious input from him, Percy spared a fleeting glance into his body. The gray silhouette of his soul had shifted, the same otherworldly patterns that had adorned it during the fiend's torturous absorption having appeared once more. Close your eyes, the former god suggested. At first, Percy creased his brow, thinking this was a bit much. Still, he followed the elder's advice in the end. It wasn't like he had anything to lose. Even without him watching, his finger continued uninterrupted, tracing the rune's contours with ease. Percy felt like an outside observer in his own body, almost getting the sense that his hand would keep going even if somebody chopped it off. Though he knew it wasn't like that at all. He was still deeply connected to the process, perhaps even more so than before. He could tell exactly how much of the enchantment he had drawn and how much was still missing. This narrative has been unlawfully taken from Novelbin. If you see it on Amazon, please report it. Fascinating. This might be more useful than I thought it would be, Percy realized. He'd been disappointed to hear that the trait wouldn't help him infuse the effects into his runes. However, he may have vastly underestimated how valuable the ability to draw them effortlessly would be. Not having to waste time worrying about getting the symbols right was huge. It would let him concentrate fully on the second part, indirectly allowing him to draw much more complex enchantments. Even out of practice as he was, he felt confident he could stick an extra control rune onto all of them in a couple of hours. That said, he didn't have any interest in upgrading his equipment right now. He'd rather wait for all the chips to fall into place. Let's try this with the silk. Resetting the slab, Percy stashed it away before bringing out a piece of gray shaft wrapped in threads that shimmered with the same color. After weeks of spinning and another spent in storage, the material wasn't looking good. It had stiffened and frayed in places, breaking here and there even under his careful touch. Thankfully, he still managed to salvage a few long segments in decent enough condition to work with. Selecting one of the better strands, he wove it into a square patch, sewing a single rune into it, a preserved handkerchief. Like before, the enchantment had been way too simple to trigger the scribing trait's instincts, yet the weaving trait was a different story. Tapping into his memories from Bogside Town, Percy channeled his inner tailor, countless tiny limbs sprouting over his fingers to help him along. Weaving the silk into clothes was arguably the easiest part of the project, something even a regular person could accomplish. At the very least, it couldn't be compared to the arduous experimentation that had gone into developing the material, a masterful spell in its own right, or the months Percy had spent learning to mass-produce it. Percy knew that he could upgrade his phantom-scale regalia in a day if he wanted. By keeping the same modular approach as before and simply replacing the components with cloth equivalents, he would be able to craft something just as strong, yet much lighter and more flexible. In fact, its decreased bulk would probably let him add an extra layer or two, making the final product stronger and packed with more enchantments. But he didn't want to do that. Half-assing the final step would only be a disservice to all the effort he'd already put into this. No. If he was going to do this, he'd do it the right way. Percy wanted to weave the whole thing out of a single strip of cloth, and he was also planning to massively overhaul the very way in which he drew his runes. Eager to try something more ambitious, Percy grabbed another piece of string, beginning work on a second handkerchief. This time, he decided to go with the same pseudo-enchantment as before, knowing it would trigger the scribing trait. Yet that was just the start. Sewing the runes after the fact like he'd just done was no different to how he normally engraved them into his armor. That wouldn't cut it. Percy wanted to work them directly into the weave itself, to make them an integral part of the structure. He knew this would not only let him fit even more of them in a tighter space, but that the enchantments would exert an even stronger influence onto the material. Two traits stirred within his soul this time, as Percy focused on both his desire to produce a structurally sound fabric and a flawless enchantment. For now, he ignored the actual effects of the runes, his priority being to get the construct right. That was when he ran into a new problem. Separate instincts tugged at his thoughts, pulling him in opposite directions. Whenever his fingers moved away from the rune's elaborate shapes to strengthen the seam, his scribing trait recoiled in disgust. The ever-shifting patterns on his soul grew more erratic, shoving the Argalios' limbs aside. Whenever Percy gave in to his new trait's demands instead, compromising the quality of the fabric to improve the enchantments, it was the weaving trait that protested. Walking on a tightrope between the two impulses, Percy tried to keep the peace within his soul, without much success. Eventually, the traits seemed to lose their patience entirely. More appendices and engraved patterns spawned on his soul, covering the rest of his hands and part of his forearms. Thankfully, they stopped at his elbows, but Percy didn't like where this was going. Sure enough, the two traits attacked one another almost immediately, beginning their battle anew. Luckily, the pain wasn't worth mentioning compared to a week prior, and the insomnia trait hadn't deigned to join in. Still, Percy found it impossible to focus on the handkerchief like this. What the hell? Is this going to happen every time I do this? Zorus sighed. With practice, you'll learn how to navigate the space between the two traits. Don't look so disappointed, though. This is ultimately a good thing. Percy frowned. Good? How? What you are experiencing is known as a spectral conflict. It occurs when two or more traits overstep in each other's territory. Naturally, they're not going to be happy about it, but you'll be able to compound their benefits once you resolve the conflict. Seeing him remain silent, the god continued. Think of it this way. Each trait grants you skills that cross into the supernatural. That said, a sufficiently talented craftsman might be able to accomplish similar feats even without the traits. After all, there's only so much you can do with a piece of string or a blob of ink. Very few tasks are challenging enough to truly push a fiend's abilities to their limit. But what happens when you have two of them battling it out for control? The difficulty spikes, I guess? Percy asked back. Once he realized Zorz's question wasn't a rhetorical one. Indeed, the difficulty spikes. And with it, the potential you can pull out of your traits spikes too. It's like a new field, the intersection of tailoring and runecrafting, that nobody but you is even qualified to study. Well, you and everyone else with the same combination of traits, of course. Percy nodded, suddenly feeling a lot more optimistic about his ongoing project. There were still a few areas to improve on, of course, such as learning to spin the silk even faster, teaching his traits to behave, and incorporating the new runes once the clone on Nesha's side was done. But he was confident about one thing. Once I'm done upgrading the regalia, I'll have a second masterful spell on par with the carnival. Nesha wrinkled her nose in disgust as she kicked the rotten banana peel away, trying to make out the faded text on the soggy flyer by her feet. Initially, she hadn't been thrilled at the idea of operating in the 121st district. The place was downright filthy. Sadly, it wasn't like they'd had too many choices. They knew they couldn't return to the places they'd been to before, and this was among the best for information gathering. Sighing, she read the details on Percy's new wanted poster, along with the others still plastered over the wall. The dim light of the nearby establishment barely illuminated the otherwise dark alley, but it would have to do. Undersir. Wanted by the Divine Root. Name Percival Avalon, the Spectral Reaper. Status: Noble, Former. Affiliations: House Avalon, Disowned. Grade: Yellow/Yellow, 2 cores. Affinity: Soul/Unknown. Bloodline: Clone, Mutated. Age: Late 30s. Estimated: Redborn. Last seen: North Pole. Other features: glowing teal eyes, invisible equipment, accompanied by green crow, suspected to not require sleep. Crimes: murder of 2 holy children. A murder of over 20 members of the Divine Root. A murder of over 20 nobles. Unauthorized infiltration of the Thirsty Valley. Unauthorized stay within the Thirsty Valley. Unauthorized escape from the Fungal Spire. A withholding of strategic class resources from the Divine Order. Fugitive from justice. Caution: extremely dangerous. Engagement not advised unless accompanied by a minimum of 4 blue cord mages. Bounty: 75 million CP. Confirmed kill. /150 million CP. Captured alive. Undersir. Wanted by the Divine Root. Name: Unnamed Crow. Status: Mutated Beast. Affiliations: Percival Avalon. Grade: Green/Yellow, 2 cores. Affinity: Beast/Ice. Age: Unknown. Last seen: North Pole. Other features: body partially made of ice, tamed, suspected demi-human level intellect, capable of conventional spellcasting, always accompanies its master, suspected to not require sleep. Crimes: murder of 2 holy children. A murder of over 20 members of the Divine Root. A murder of over 20 nobles. A strategic class resource. Fugitive from justice. Caution: extremely dangerous. Engagement not advised unless accompanied by a minimum of 4 blue cord mages. Bounty: 75 million CP. Confirmed kill. /150 million CP. Captured alive. Undersir. Wanted by the Divine Root. Name: Nesha Veritas. Status: Noble, Former. Affiliations: House Veritas. Destroyed. /House Avalon. Suspected. Grade: Yellow. Age: mid-20s, orange-born. Last seen: Camelot Province. Stolen content alert. This content belongs on Novelbin. Report any occurrences. Other features. Spectacled. Crimes. A unauthorized escape from the fungal spire. A withholding of strategic class resources from the divine order. Fugitive from justice. Notes. Bounty on kill retracted. Only wanted alive. Bounty. 80 million CP. Captured alive. Undersir. Nesha clicked her tongue in annoyance, realizing the numbers had gone up again. Even her own, albeit not as much as the others. You two are dragging me down with you. She hadn't been seen with Percy and Mickey since before the Thirsty Valley. Yet the root had kept increasing her bounty all the same, doing so whenever her friends committed another crime. Worse still, their pursuers seemed to have finally realized that they wouldn't be catching Percy or Mickey anytime soon. So they'd clearly decided that their best hope at learning the recipe would be to capture her alive. Nobody knew that she could hold her own in a fight, but they did know that she wasn't traveling with the others at the moment, so she was viewed as an easy target by the bounty hunters. This had forced her to be even more cautious than she otherwise would have been. Well, excuse me for not handing myself over to the root, Percy replied, his voice oozing with sarcasm. Shaking her head, Nesha walked away calmly, but quickly. With her shorter hair, the lack of eyeglasses, and her higher grade, people would be hard-pressed to connect her to the girl in the picture. That said, the last thing she needed was to be seen reading her own wanted poster. Tonight had been another waste of time. Thanks to Percy's insomnia trait, she didn't need to sleep, for now at least, though she wasn't looking forward to bidding the clone farewell. The extra hours had served her well thus far, allowing her to spend her days practicing runecrafting with him, and her nights investigating the destruction of her house. Sadly, the latter task wasn't going as well as the former. The only thing she'd managed to gather so far was that the leader of House Asclepius, McCann, had acted somewhat suspiciously in the years leading to the disaster. The old White Corps had developed a sudden interest in alchemy, seemingly overnight, spending a brief tenure in the guild. It hadn't lasted long. He'd only stayed there for a few months, learning the basics of the art and hunting a few blue wasps atop the 5th level of the spire at his leisure, before returning home. People hadn't thought much of it. Older nobles, especially the ones hailing from the great houses who didn't really have any enemies or rivals to worry about, often picked up new hobbies to break the monotony that came with their extremely long lives. It wasn't every day that somebody at the very top of the ladder did that, of course, but similar things had happened in the past. Nesha hadn't been as quick to dismiss this seemingly unimportant detail, however. On one hand, she knew that nobody would have dared to mess with a family associated with the Great House without McCann's explicit approval. On the other, she found the timing too odd to have been a coincidence. Unfortunately, she lacked the connections to learn more. Her enemy was the very person in charge of Remir's entire information network. After all, the whole point of destroying her house had probably been to keep some incriminating truth buried, and this had all happened several years ago. But she wasn't one to give up this easily. If she didn't have the means to pry any deeper, she just had to expand her influence. If that wasn't enough, then she'd grow strong enough to knock on that bastard's door one day and interrogate him herself. Percy had given her all the tools that she needed to break past her limits. Compared to his ambitious goals of becoming a god, what did a lowly wight amount to? Maybe I should ask my handsome boyfriend to take care of this for me, she joked. 5 minutes ago, you were complaining that we got your bounty raised. Now you're asking me to assassinate the leader of House Asclepius. Percy scoffed. She shrugged. By the time you're strong enough to do that, people will have forgotten about me anyway. It was still dark out when they reached the 108th district where their inn was located. The quality there was piss poor, literally. In fact, she'd spotted the same drunkard emptying his bladder in the corridor multiple times this month alone. And he wasn't even the only one. At least, her room was livable. It sure helped that she didn't need to use the bed. Kicking the door shut behind her, she tussled the sheets a little to give any potential snoopers the impression that she'd spent the morning sleeping. Next, she grabbed a half-stale loaf of bread from her nightstand, munching on it as she undressed. A quick shower and a more comfortable change of clothes later, she sat on her prized chair, the cleanest one she'd found in the room. Not that she'd eat off it, but it was the only one that lacked the questionable stains the others had. They were about to begin their runecrafting practice. They'd been working even harder lately, since they knew Percy's main body would be needing the injection of knowledge pretty soon. When she spoke, "I'm gonna miss you when you're gone. You know you're free to visit, right?" he asked with a chuckle. "Got an address by any chance? What do you take me for? An amateur? Sail to the northern seas and look for the tree-shaped cloud. Then follow the waves to the 53rd uninhabited island to your right. We'll be there for another hour or so." She laughed, shaking her head. "Seriously though, I'll miss you too," Percy continued with a sigh. "I suppose we'll have to stick with the long distance for a while." "I'm sorry," she said. "It's my fault. I should have stayed with you and Mickey. It sounds like you two could have used the hell." "Don't," he cut her off. "We both have our own things to focus on. Besides, you're helping us plenty as it is. I wouldn't have wanted to see you getting chased by blues all over Remire anyway." Clenching her fists, she nodded, a silent understanding settling between them. The best way for her to help Percy and Mickey was to assist the clone with his current task. His main body would have to replicate their success on his own later, but it would hopefully be easier the second time around, especially if they managed to register the spell upgrade before the clone left. Gathering mana from both of her cores, she allowed them to blend between her hands, merging into something new. Nesha hadn't found time to work on the dance. Drawing so much ambient mana inside the inn wasn't very practical anyway. However, she had made a lot of progress with affinity fusion. Motes of black clung to the earth mana, the brown substance turning darker and folding rapidly onto itself, before eventually settling into something denser. As soon as the mana calmed down, Nesha willed it to manifest into a construct, a pitch-black orb seemingly cast out of obsidian forming between her hands. She didn't stop there. Preparing more of the substance, she added to the sphere, slowly molding it into something larger and shaped differently. An hour later, a glossy statue stood in the middle of her room, as tall as she was. It was humanoid, though its features weren't very defined. According to Percy, it somewhat resembled the golems he had faced in the Vault's yellow combat challenges, though its purpose was very different. This was the object they'd be carving their enchantments onto. Percy marveled at the human-shaped construct for a second, once again reminded of how handy his girlfriend's fused mana was. The glossy stone, which they dubbed dimensional onyx, greatly resembled the material their spatial amulets were made of, though there were a few key differences. Nesha's creation lacked the bright, star-like specks scattered across the surface of the amulets. More importantly, this wasn't a naturally occurring mineral but a material fashioned out of a mortal's mana, meaning it wouldn't last indefinitely by itself. Even so, it was remarkably practical. It was easier to produce than Percy's crystallized mana, at least before he'd started cheating with his spirit-forged effigy. It also survived much longer, a couple of months even without preservation runes. Finally, it drastically boosted the power of Nesha's enchantments. Still, its temporary nature meant that they couldn't use it to craft true spatial amulets. Not unless they were fine with the artifacts collapsing one day and dumping their contents in some random location, or worse, destroying them outright. Even if Nesha equipped them with self-repair enchantments, which she had already learned how to draw, they wouldn't function properly with anyone else's mana. Sadly, Percy and Nesha understood how hard-pressed they would be to find a second person with her unique combination of affinities, even among the Moirai, let alone somebody capable of fusing them in the same way. If they wanted to craft more permanent spatial amulets, they'd need to acquire dimensional marble, the very material that had inspired the name of Nesha's fused mana. The problem was that the resource was heavily monopolized by House Etna, and they were currently wanted fugitives. Other controlled resources, like elixirs, weren't as difficult for them to obtain. Elixirs were thousands of times cheaper per unit, and they exchanged hands in massive quantities across Remire. After all, a huge percentage of the population needed to consume them on a daily basis. Compared to that, there were very few spatial amulets around, and they were reserved for the elites at the top of the noble families. As for their raw materials, very few outside the Great House even had a use for them. Thank Phoebe we don't have a shortage of storage space anymore, Percy thought. Nesha had originally learned runecrafting with the hopes of crafting more of the useful artifacts for the group, but they'd luckily outgrown that need. Even better, she had found several other uses for both the esoteric art and her fused mana. Specifically, the material was perfect for her traps. She couldn't store them inside the amulets because their enchantments were fundamentally the same, intentionally unstable pocket runes meant for killing or maiming rather than storing or preserving. Still, Nesha could pack a lot more power into the dimensional onyx than she could on regular stone. By adding self-repair enchantments and concealment runes into the mix, she could maintain the traps and unleash them onto her unsuspecting victims a lot more easily. The only reason she hadn't filled her room with traps was because she'd rather not have to explain herself to the innkeeper should he decide to stick his nose into her business one day. Regardless, Nesha's affinity fusion wasn't the point of their current project, just the convenient material that they'd been using for a while. In fact, Percy and Nesha had gone out of their way to ensure that all the enchantments involved could function irrespective of one's affinity. They were much more interested in the underlying theory than any individual application, and Percy needed all the new skills and knowledge they acquired to be transferable to his main body, who possessed an entirely different set of mana types. Ensure your favorite authors get the support they deserve. Read this novel on the original website. I'll go first, Nesha said, snapping him out of his thoughts. They typically took turns drawing the runes, the short breaks helping them rest and consolidate their gains. Nodding internally, Percy watched his girlfriend fuse some mana around her finger before engraving an intricate enchantment onto the statue. It contained control, growth, and memory runes, the building blocks of Percy's own controlled self-repair enchantments. But that wasn't everything. There was a fourth type, the adaptation runes. Adaptive self-repair enchantments differed in that they could accept foreign mana types. This was meant to somewhat mitigate the issues Percy and Nesha were facing, though it didn't solve them completely. Enchantments like this would behave in all sorts of unpredictable ways when infused with the wrong mana type. The exact results would depend on how the new affinity interacted with the runes or with the original mana types that were supposed to be fed into the enchantments. For example, injecting ice mana into an adaptive heating enchantment designed to be fueled by fire mana would either weaken its effect severely, or even reverse it entirely in some cases, causing the runes to sap heat instead of emitting it. These interactions weren't universal, however, and had to be tested on a case-by-case basis. Adaptive self-repair enchantments fed with the wrong mana would usually still do what they were supposed to, though they would introduce flaws during the regeneration. If done repeatedly, the constructs in question risked falling apart. In other words, Nesha would still find it difficult to craft spatial amulets for others. Repaired with other affinities, the devices might last a little longer than they would if left alone, but they would still crumble in the end. The same was true for Percy's size. Given how he fought, his weapons tended to shatter and regenerate hundreds of times during the span of a battle. There was no way they would survive something like that if he fed them with the wrong mana. Even worse, others wouldn't be able to use his constructs either, and not just because of this incompatibility. Without access to Percy's soul affinity or the willpower embedded in the weapons, they'd also be missing out on the scythe's autonomy. That didn't mean the adaptation runes were useless. However, had that been the case, Percy wouldn't have bought the books on them. Repairing a construct with a different affinity often infused it with unique properties. There was typically a sweet spot where an object could be altered in a beneficial way without its structural integrity being compromised. Thankfully, it was always possible to reset the constructs to their flawless state by simply repairing them with the correct affinity. If Percy was careful, he hoped he could channel Mickey's soul-freezing ice into his scythes at key moments to increase the lethality of his attacks, before flooding them with phantom mana to restore them to their original form. He had no idea what the exotic resource might do to his armor, but he was interested in exploring that too. Outside of that, he also hoped his clones would be able to maintain the scythes longer like this. Normally, their finite stash of mana wasn't enough to get them far, but the adaptive enchantments would let them borrow mana from their hosts. Of course, the clones would still have to use the weapons sparingly. Not to mention that the scythes would have a much lower impact whenever Percy possessed greens or blues. That said, having more options was never a bad thing. As soon as Nesha was done adding the fourth rune into the enchantment, She paused for a moment to examine it. Only once she confirmed that it worked as intended did she continue. The first controlled self-repair enchantment was always the most crucial, because it would allow them to undo any subsequent mistakes, at least within its range of influence. However, their project was a lot more ambitious than this. What they'd been trying to master over the past year wasn't any individual rune or enchantment, no matter how complex or useful it might be. Sure, they'd done that too. They'd learned the vault's written language and read all the books back-to-back multiple times. They'd grown proficient with all the runes they had access to and even learned to combine them in various interesting ways. They'd even developed a large pseudo-enchantment involving 18 different runes, the one that Nesha was currently drawing on the statue. The intricate self-repair enchantment she'd already carved was nothing more than a small part of a greater whole. But there was something else that had consumed most of their time. Something much more difficult and downright fundamental to the art of Magiscript. It had to do with the way an enchantment could be drawn repeatedly and linked unto itself to amplify its effects and expand its scope. In fact, after having studied this topic deeply, Percy was confident that this was the very requirement that differentiated those capable of undertaking the green level of the Vault's Magiscript challenge from those who weren't. Unit Cell Theory. Nesha continued carving symbols into the construct's shoulder, the pseudo-enchantment gradually taking shape. Each rune had a circular design, but the final pattern looked anything but round thanks to the intricate ways she'd connected them. Some runes were nested inside others, forming concentric circles. Others had been fused side by side. A few even overlapped partially, with Nesha cleverly exploiting shared features to create a more compact arrangement. By the time she finished, the pseudo-enchantment resembled a clover, roughly the size of her palm. They'd made sure it could just barely wrap around the shaft of Percy's scythes. It contained 5 distinct enchantments, each broken down further into multiple runes. The first was the self-repair enchantment she'd started with, incorporating control, adaptation, memory, and growth runes. The second was another big one, the structural reinforcement enchantment that they had studied from the most recent batch of books. It included 2 runes Percy had already been familiar with, the hardness and force absorptions runes that he'd been drawing on his armor for years, alongside the new integrity runes meant to unify and enhance their effects. Like the self-repairs, they'd also added control and adaptation runes to ensure it could accept foreign mana and be toggled on or off independently. In fact, they'd done the same with the remaining 3 enchantments, which would have otherwise only consisted of a single rune each. Preservation, concealment, and lightness runes, classic staples of many magical items. Percy and Nesha were proud of the monstrous pseudo-enchantment they'd spent months developing, knowing it would serve them well in the future. Percy intended to incorporate it directly into his armor, and even Nesha was considering designing something similar for her own use after he was gone. Everything they'd included so far was universally applicable, so it could easily form the core of all their enchanted objects in the future. That said, they both understood they'd have to add more specialized components for certain applications. For example, Percy would need to include sharpness runes for his scythes, naturally paired with their own adaptation and control runes. When it came to his cauldron, things got a lot more complicated since he'd have to add heat, pressure, and rotation runes as well as several more controls. He wasn't very thrilled about having to accomplish all of that by himself though. "I'll worry about that later. At least the new trait will help. You know," Nesha said as soon as she was done, wiping sweat off her brow. "I still can't believe your main body got himself a rune-crafting trait after we spent a year practicing without it. Tell me about it." Percy concurred. "I'd want to slap him too, if he wasn't me." Well, it could have been worse. Had Percy absorbed the Symbolan right after parting ways with Nesha, he would have still lacked a way to get the trait to her, and they would have spent the whole year frustrated about it. Besides, he wasn't sure he would have been willing to trade Insomnia for scribing. While he had yet to see how potent his new trait was, the previous one had also helped them plenty. Either way, they knew they hadn't wasted their time. Nesha would have needed to learn everything without the trait anyway, and the extra challenge had only pushed them to improve further. Taking over Nesha's body, Percy stretched their fingers before replicating his girlfriend's actions. He began drawing a copy of the pseudo-enchantment next to the original. The second clover-shaped formation was mirrored, slightly rotated and shifted by a few centimeters. It was meant to be fused to the first one in several places, and this was the optimal layout they'd discovered so far. It would allow them to pack the clovers as tightly as possible, hopefully fitting hundreds of them across the construct when all was said and done. The clover was their unit cell, the building block of a much larger enchantment. Some of the most sophisticated enchantments in existence, such as the one engraved on the gargantuan cube that contained the artificial world, were composed of trillions upon trillions of runes, if not more. No single person could hope to draw or even comprehend all those enchantments at once. Not even someone as powerful and talented as Metatron, the very titan who had invented Magiscript. The only way to handle something of that scale was to break it down into smaller, more easily digestible components. Each unit cell could be as complex as the one engraving it could handle. Somebody like Metatron could probably fit thousands or even tens of thousands of runes into a single unit cell. In fact, that was exactly what the Titan had done when he created Percy's storage seal. Percy didn't know if that had been the Titan's limit, but he did know one thing: Metatron hadn't used actual Magiscript while crafting the artifact. The whole seal, advanced as it was nothing more than a single unit cell. Percy hadn't been able to tell at the time, but he had learned a lot more about the topic after reading the books. Another thing he'd come to realize was that Metatron had designed the seal in such a way that it could easily be upgraded in the future by simply linking it with an identical copy. Currently, its internal space was limited to a single cube 10 meters across, and it could only be split in half up to 3 times, for a total of 8 smaller seals as large as crates. Fusing it with a second seal would double the cube's dimensions, or equivalently, allow it to be divided into up to 16 of the smallest ones. Adding another 2 seals would double it further, and so on. The bastard wants me to keep begging for more. Percy had to suppress a bitter chuckle. Back when he first obtained his seal, he'd thought he'd never run out of storage space again. The problem was that he'd been forced to split it into its smallest denominations to equip all of his clones, which was quite inefficient with regards to its volume. Stolen novel. Please report. Perhaps, the ancient god had expected Percy's clone capacity to increase. With a single move, the old fox had not only given Percy a reason to keep earning credits, but also given himself a way to monitor Percy's limits. Shaking his head, Percy concentrated on the task at hand. His dealings with the Titan weren't a priority right now. In any case, linking multiple unit cells into a grid was a way for Percy to cheat his way to a much larger pseudo-enchantment. The end result would be a lot more potent than if he simply included the same number of clovers separated from one another, as joining them together would not only amplify their effects but also allow them to permeate each other more seamlessly. If Percy hadn't horribly misunderstood the underlying theory, this would improve his armor in several ways. The blind spots in his concealment runes should finally disappear, allowing him to completely hide his constructs from anyone below blue. This would also eliminate the weak spots previously found in the gaps between the hardness and absorption runes, offering better protection. Finally, it should speed up the regeneration provided by the self-repair enchantments. Obviously, there were still limits he couldn't overcome. Doubling the number of runes or joining them better wouldn't double their potency. Runes were like whispers in the universe's ears, asking it to lax its rules slightly in certain ways. Having twice as many mouths whispering at the same time might affect the world's willingness to comply, but there were diminishing returns. Still, this was good. Between the new runes and enchantments, how much better Percy and Nesha had gotten at drawing them, and their ability to combine them, he was feeling confident he could have meaningfully upgraded his armor even without taking the silk into account. Now, they just had to register that pesky spell upgrade that had eluded them for weeks. A few minutes later, he was done, a second clover tightly joined with the first. Passing the reins to Nesha, he watched her draw the third one, before taking over for the fourth. Like that, they took turns adding more unit cells to the grid, slowly covering the statue's body in runes. Every now and then, one of them made a mistake, forcing them to rely on the previously drawn self-repairs to erase the new symbols. They didn't let that get to them, however, being used to the process by now. As soon as the last rays of sunlight seeping through the gaps in the curtains disappeared, they took a longer break for dinner. Nesha had decided to pause her information gathering for the rest of the week, so they dove back to the project almost immediately after. By the following night, they had engraved the construct's right arm and much of its chest with clovers. 2 days later, the grid had expanded to the rest of its torso, head, and second arm. It wasn't until the 5th afternoon that Percy managed to draw the final rune on the statue's left foot, plugging the last hole in the network. They didn't even get a chance to examine the enchantment to make sure the unit cell was functional when Percy's status spoke. Congratulations! Your spell has evolved. Intricate runic grid, refined - superior runic grid, refined. Seeing the notification, his borrowed lips curled up. Did you also? He asked. Aha, Nesha replied with a nod. This was a spell they'd registered several months ago, and one that they had upgraded together every step of the way. They could both use it separately, of course, or otherwise their status might have not recognized their achievement, though each of them would need a lot more time to draw all the clovers by themselves. The original spell, Fine Runic Grid, had been a crude one. At the time, the unit cell had only contained a single enchantment involving a measly 5 runes, a huge victory at the time, but not that big a deal in hindsight. In addition to their smaller scope, the first iteration of the enchantments had been even bulkier than today's clovers. Percy and Nesha had only been capable of fitting a fraction of them onto the same surface. Even worse, the resulting pattern had been flawed, riddled with gaps and mismatched connections. Yet, Phoebe's decree had still surprised them by registering their prototype as a proper spell. Percy hadn't expected that, because his status had never bothered to acknowledge his enchantments on their own before. Granted, many of his spells included runes, but the enchantments had always been part of something bigger, never the focal point of the spell. Evidently, that had only been a testament to Percy's previous lack of skill. Even in its imperfect state, the fine runic grid had clearly packed enough punch to be recognized as a crude spell, irrespective of what it had been drawn on. After doubling the number of enchantments and runes, shrinking the unit cell further, and improving the quality of the grid, he and Nesha had elevated the spell to refined. Though they hadn't stopped at that, knowing that there had still been room for improvement. And today's notification had just proven them right. I suppose this is goodbye then, Nesha said once they caught their breath. I suppose it is. Percy sighed. Are you sure you'll be okay by yourself? I've been by myself for months, you know. Even if somebody had recognized me, there's only so much you could have done to help. She wasn't wrong. Percy could have informed his main body, though it wasn't like he and Mickey could have broken into the city to rescue her. Hell, they'd been driven out of the damn continent. Not to mention returning to such a crowded location, watched by the Root and governed by over 100 blues. Still, knowing how she was doing had given him peace of mind. He wouldn't have that moving forward. Percy was also worried about Elaine, of course, especially after losing contact with her. But this was different. His cousin was a blue and had their family to watch over her. Sure, House Avalon was in hot water too, but it was something. Nesha had nobody but him. Be careful, he said, stealing his resolve. Only once she nodded did he start retracting his wisp from her injuries. Leaving a host had never been as bittersweet. Over the past year, there had been several times when he'd wished he'd had a physical body to embrace her. Even so, he'd thoroughly enjoyed being by her side. Even ignoring their magical achievements, he was more than happy to bring these memories back to his main body. Right as the cord was about to yank him away, Percy paused for a moment to examine the contents of his seal. Once he confirmed for the 100th time that all the secondary ingredients the original had commissioned were there, including those sweet gravity plants that he'd been waiting for, he finally left his girlfriend's body behind. His thoughts blended with another's the following instant. Memories of close battles, numerous spell upgrades, and countless adventures on distant worlds flashed through his mind. They almost buried his time in Twilight City beneath a mountain of other experiences. But he didn't let them. Percy clung to their shared laughs and the feeling of his girlfriend's lips parting into a smile, his heart already thrumming with longing. Opening his eyes, he found himself on Mickey's back, exactly where he'd been the previous second, but also not. The clone's return had caused him to mess up the strand of silk he'd been working with. Yet he didn't much care. He could spin more later. Feeling the cool breeze licking his face, he couldn't help but compare it to the acrid stench of piss and excrement seeping into Nesh's room, or the stale city air that they'd been breathing for months. Strictly speaking, this was an upgrade. Yet Percy couldn't help but focus on what was missing. Clenching his fists, he made a silent promise to himself. I'll reach out as soon as I can. The clone had been searching for a new body for months. Percy had no idea whether his 3 counterparts had gotten any luckier, but he certainly hadn't found what he'd been looking for. He'd actually skipped half a dozen lesser springs during this trip, each missed opportunity like a stab in his severed little soul. But it couldn't be helped. Lesser springs were good. Yet Percy understood he couldn't afford to get distracted every time he encountered one. Sure, there was always a chance, albeit a small one, that he'd find a new decree or alchemic principle, but he knew he would be very unlikely to extend his lifespan or accelerate his advancements by relying on them alone. After all, if these worlds had what he was searching for, they wouldn't have been classified as lesser springs in the first place, would they? That was why he'd decided to steel himself and reserve his time for only the most promising places in the universe. That wasn't to say he wouldn't visit more lesser springs in the future, but they had to truly stand out for him to bother, much like Gallimus did. Or at least, that had been his goal at the start of his mission. More than once, Percy had considered giving up and settling for the next lesser spring he saw. Perhaps his criteria had been unreasonable to begin with. What if he never found a greater spring? Would he waste his whole life searching for a needle in a haystack? Maybe his best shot was to gather minor insights from lots of lesser springs instead, slowly building his own ladder to divinity, one plank at a time. Get a grip, Percy. It's only been a few months, he kept telling himself. He'd always known it would be difficult to find one of the peak worlds. Besides, he hadn't really wasted that much time yet. He could reconsider in a decade, or 10, if he kept finding nothing. On top of that, his main body had asked the clones to stay away for at least 6 months. Unless of course they found something genuinely valuable. Percy was currently working on consolidating his gains and upgrading his armor, so he didn't want to be interrupted too frequently. Thus, the clone had been forced to stick to his monotonous journey, endlessly scanning the sea of souls while counting the days to his return. It was one day or night, he couldn't really tell, like any other, when it finally happened. A giant world, several times larger than Remir, appeared in the distance. Granted, Percy couldn't observe the planet itself, but he could see the dense swarm of souls that stretched as far as his senses could reach. After a rough count, he estimated this world was home to over a dozen times Remir's population. And that wasn't everything, their average grade was much higher too. Greens and blues were practically everywhere, and he guessed they had over 100,000 violets, tens of thousands of whites and thousands of demigods. Most notably, they also seemed to have hundreds of gods. Their joint radiance made it difficult for Percy to even glance at the place, let alone examine his potential hosts carefully. I'll manage, he thought, his soul lighting up with greed. This place was obviously teeming with danger, but also brimming with opportunity. It had to be a greater spring, right? Even if it somehow wasn't one, it would still be the most developed lesser spring Percy had ever seen. Either way, he knew his main body wouldn't blame him for taking his chances. Unfortunately, he had yet to perfect his new skill. Percy wasn't confident in fully possessing an unwilling host, though he estimated he would still have a few decent options even in that situation. Another issue was that he hadn't kept the connection to his main body open, which meant that he was limited to his own stash. Healing a blue wouldn't be easy with so little mana. This content has been unlawfully taken from Novelbin. Report any instances of this story if found elsewhere. Well, it couldn't be helped. The original had been way too busy to keep 4 chords open for months on end. Perhaps Percy would be better served going for a green host, though he didn't want to be too restricted. On Remir, greens did hold some status. But here, they were probably worthless, no more than commoners. Let's go for a blue. I'd rather not find myself trapped in a tiny village. I'll just have to pick the one with the lightest injuries and hope I can fix them. Having made his mind up, Percy searched for a dying soul suited to his needs. After dismissing several choices, his gaze landed on one he found promising. Not too old, nor too young. Probably a yellow-born who's lived for a couple hundred years. That didn't sound right. If this was a greater spring, shouldn't a yellow-born have advanced to violet by that age? Have I made a mistake? He couldn't help but wonder. It was possible. Though it was also possible that these people didn't have a way to accelerate their advancements, but instead a method to directly extend their lifespans. Something like that could also allow a yellow-born to ascend past white, though Percy would be slightly disappointed if this was the case. Ideally, he wanted a way to reach green sooner. It would not only extend his lifespan, but also raise his fighting strength, something that he desperately needed, given how many enemies were waiting for him back on Remir. Then again, this might be a good thing. For a while now, he'd been operating under the assumption that many of the greater springs had achieved their elevated status thanks to the same cyan powder that he'd incorporated into his Aurora Dew. It would make sense, considering how easy the resource was to produce. The problem was that the knowledge was now useless to him, so he couldn't help but hope for something different. Well, either way, there's no point in guessing. I'll have my answer soon enough. Not wasting any more time, Percy dove straight toward the soul he'd singled out. Other than looking for somebody more lightly injured, Percy had picked a blue located as far away from the gods as possible, just in case. It hadn't been easy, because the deities seemed to be scattered around the planet, but he had done his best. Entering his host's body, Percy was greeted with a wave of suspicion. Not that strange, but also not a great sign of things to come. "Who are you?" A voice cold like a serpent's hiss rang through Percy's soul. "Unless you have a way to heal yourself, I'm your only shot at survival," Percy replied matter-of-factly. His host didn't respond immediately, seemingly taking a few seconds to evaluate their options. "Name your terms," the blue eventually said, somewhat guardedly. "I know this is a greater spring, and I know what that means," Percy said, cutting to the chase. "I'll heal you if you give me what I want." Had his host been a child like Enki or Dua, Percy might have offered to help them for free. That said, he had no intention of giving his services away to everyone he met. This was Percy's first greater spring since the Moirai's world, which he'd only visited by accident decades ago. So he wasn't going to walk away empty-handed. Besides, this person was a centuries-old blue. They could afford to pay up. Some hesitation bubbled up within his host's soul, though it didn't last long. "Fine, I'll pass you my people's core cleansing technique." Percy thought he heard wrong. He'd already surmised that he was dealing with a life extension method, not a means of advancement. The blue had also agreed a little too easily considering their initial reaction. "Are they trying to screw me over?" Percy wondered, though he kept those thoughts to himself. Outwards, he simply gave his host a mental nod before beginning to stitch their injuries. Either way, Percy knew he had all the leverage. Manipulating the silver tendrils extending out of the blue's wounds, Percy weaved them into preservation runes like he usually did. Only, this time he added a little extra. He included a control rune in each enchantment, giving him the ability to freely turn their effects off later, in case his host tried anything funny. Even without doing this, Percy could still cause a lot of damage on the way out, but that would destroy the preservation runes, and he didn't think he'd have enough mana to replace them. This way, he would be able to freely flaunt his control at a moment's notice, forcing the blue to back down. Temporarily deactivating the preservation runes wouldn't worsen his host's injuries, but it would accelerate the soul's degradation, possibly beyond its ability to recover. Hopefully, it won't come to that. As long as the blue upheld their end of the bargain, all would be good. Still, Percy couldn't shake the gut feeling that his new host couldn't be trusted, and he'd rather not turn his back to the old monster. He'd only managed to stitch about half of the man's, Percy thought his host was male, injuries when his mana ran dry. Perhaps he could have done more if he hadn't wasted it on control runes, but he was confident he'd done enough for the blue to survive, as long as he behaved. Tapping into his host's senses, Percy felt their eyes opening. A grotesque scene greeting him. Percy found himself surrounded by mutilated corpses, so thoroughly disfigured that even he, hardened by experience as he was, struggled to keep his gaze on them. They seemed to belong to the same species as his host, mostly humanoid from the waist up, with their lower halves replaced by long, serpentine tails that stretched out for a couple of meters. White scales coated their bodies, two curved fangs jutting down from their upper lips. Their forked tongues hung limp, resting atop ground still wet with blood. Their crimson eyes, slit-pupilled and glassy, still held a fading spark of horror. The males were bullier than the females, their necks and the side of their heads flaring outward in cobra-like hoods. "What the hell happened here?" Percy asked, his opinion of his host having sunk to a new low. "I got ambushed," the blue replied flatly. "I fought to escape. I almost made it, but not quite." The man pushed himself upright and immediately slithered away, seemingly unwilling to let Percy examine the carnage a moment longer than necessary. "Yeah, not buying it," Percy thought to himself. There were children among the bodies. Did that bastard expect Percy to believe the kids had attacked him too? Clearly, only a couple of the man's opponents had been powerful enough to hold their own, rapidly dimming fragments of their blue cores still visible via mana sense. The rest had to be green or lower, the organs having crumbled already. All of them had died the same way, impaled by conjured steel swords, constructs made of blue mana. Percy's host was the only one sporting wounds of a different kind. A few burn marks, scattered and severe, some of them serious enough to have led to the man's death. There was no question. He was the aggressor here, not the victim. As they moved away from the center of the massacre, Percy got a better look at the area. It appeared to be a town, or used to be, at any rate, some intact buildings still standing in the distance. Most of them had been reduced to rubble, however, smoking puddles of molten rock and hill-sized mounds of fine dust mixing in with the gravel. The air reeked of burnt flesh and spilled blood, the silence so complete it pressed down on the senses. A ghost town. A graveyard. Another thing Percy noticed was that his host had an extra sense. One that he'd experienced before, but only in beasts. Never in sapients. Every time the man's forked tongue flickered, Percy could feel the temperature of their surroundings in sharp, granular detail. Some parts of the battlefield still burned hot enough to incinerate flesh on contact. But the bodies? Cold as ice. All of them. For some reason. One that Percy didn't much care for, this sack of shit had decided to attack an entire town by himself, butchering every last inhabitant. The strongest among them had clearly put up a fight, just barely managing to drag their enemy down with their last breaths. And the bastard still has the gall to lie to me. The realization left a sour pit in his stomach. He couldn't help but question whether saving this man's life had been a mistake. Of course, it wasn't too late to change that. It would only take Percy a single thought to unravel all the stitches, and to tear the blue's soul apart for good measure. He was really tempted to do just that, gains be damned. But he hesitated. Killing his host wouldn't bring his victims back to life. It would only rob Percy of the opportunities he'd traveled so far for. Sighing inwardly, he decided to wait. He wasn't in a hurry. He could end the blue whenever he wanted. At the very least, he had no intention of letting him harm another innocent under his watch. But that didn't mean he couldn't wring what he wanted out of the old monster. As for what comes later, we'll see. Having made his mind up, Percy was about to demand the cleansing technique he'd been promised, when the blue suddenly froze in his tracks. Without a word, he removed his clothes, a loose, sleeveless tunic hanging open over his chest, before triggering some change within. Percy felt their flesh squirm and their innards churn as a profound sense of wrongness overtook their shared body. Their scales instantly dried and withered, the man's jaw opening wide enough to swallow 2 watermelons side by side as Percy's perspective shifted. Their surroundings faded to black, a wave of nausea rattling their brain. A moment later, Percy found himself wedged tightly inside a narrow tunnel. The air was warm and humid, stinking of rotten flesh. His host wriggled, pressing against the walls as he pushed forward. Their body expanded and grew stronger with each movement, the tunnel stretching and losing its integrity. A flash of white appeared ahead. The blue reached for it with a now tiny hand, grabbing at the end of the tunnel to pull himself outside. Blinded by the light, Percy couldn't help but squint for a moment, the colors around them eventually settling into those of the ruined town. This narrative has been unlawfully taken from Novelbin. If you see it on Amazon, please report it. Percy looked down. Their body had been reduced to that of a young child. Their scales were now fresh and unblemished, their previous injuries gone like a bad dream. The tunnel they just crawled through had been the Blue's own throat, the hollowed husk of their old body carelessly lying beneath them like a worn coat. Scooping the blue tunic up, Percy's host draped it over his new shoulders, the cloth now a few sizes too large. The man didn't seem to mind, however, having clearly experienced this many times before. What a bizarre ability, Percy thought. It was undeniably useful, but it raised a few questions. Had he misjudged the Blue? Maybe those children had been adults after all, killed while recovering from their injuries. Perhaps the man hadn't lied about the ambush. No, there weren't any discarded bodies near them. Besides, our grade hasn't dropped, so there's no reason theirs would have. Percy was almost certain those kids had been actual children. Besides reevaluating his host's morality, Percy couldn't help but wonder whether this ability could be used to reverse a person's age, allowing mortals to live longer, thus reaching a higher grade. Hoping for some answers, Percy pulled up his status, though he made sure to keep the information to himself, still not ready to trust his host. Undersir. Kasserith, Percival's clone. Mana cores. A Mana Core 1, blue metal. A Mana Core 2 seed? Domain. A field. Awakened. Bloodline. A molt. Rebuild your body by shedding your skin and any damaged organs. The amount of discarded flesh and thus the size of the new body are determined by the extent of your injuries. Spectral traits. Weaving boosts one's proclivity in manipulating one-dimensional structures. Insomnia eliminates the need for sleep. Ascribing boosts one's proclivity in expressing meaning onto any written medium. Spells. A soul-to-soul, crude. Spirit-forged cauldron, refined. A spectral art. Phantom scale regalia, masterful. Spectral art. Phantom spun silk, masterful. Spectral art. Supreme runic matrix, masterful. Alchemic principles. Extraction. Separate and condense an ingredient's essence. Opacification. Delay an ingredient's activation rate. Redirection. Adjust an ingredient's effect. Deattunement. Prevent multiple conflicting ingredients from reacting with one another. Bonding. Enrich an ingredient with crystallized pure mana. Restructuring. Alter an ingredient's phase. Scaling. Brew a greater volume of ingredients at once. Decrees. Phoebe's decree grants access to your status. Morai's decree, incomplete, grants the seed of a second mana core. Requires potent life mana to germinate. Metatron's decree, open a one-way portal to the vault of magic at will. EA's decree, modified, augments and enhances your status. Obatala's decree, modified, augments and enhances your status, allows you to effortlessly deploy your domain in its strongest state. Undersir. There was a lot to unpack. As Percy had suspected, his host possessed the composite metal affinity. The blood-soaked constructs sticking out of the corpses, along with the 3 sets of mana channels coursing through Kasserith's body, Earth, Lightning, and a third type Percy had never seen before, left no doubt that the Blue had been the one to slaughter all the townsfolk. Evidently, Kasserith's molt was his personal bloodline, not some species-wide trait. His victims wouldn't have shared it unless they'd all been related to him by blood, something Percy considered not only unlikely, but also disturbing in its own right. They couldn't have all been at Blue, or he wouldn't have stood a chance, Percy reminded himself. Yeah, the kids had probably been kids. This man was a complete monster. Other than that, Percy had access to a domain, just the standard version that every Blue got by default, as well as his spectral traits, alchemic principles, and whatever spells he could cast from this body. That said, he'd already exhausted his reserves of phantom mana. so he wouldn't be able to do much. If Khasrith's bloodline was the result of a decree, and it probably was, it didn't show in Percy's status. Percy could still activate the ability while possessing his host, but it didn't look like he'd be bringing it back to Remir. I hope it wasn't just because of this Molt bloodline that their world turned into a greater spring. What a waste of a trip that would be. The good news was that Percy didn't feel like activating the bloodline had extended their lifespan. If it had, the effect wasn't nearly as dramatic as what happened when somebody advanced. This filled him with hope that Khasrith's people had found something else to rely on. Then again, it was possible that the bloodline's effects only accumulated after repeated use. Oblivious to Percy's thoughts, the boy tore a chunk off his discarded flesh, rolling it into a ball the size of an orange before swallowing it whole with a wet gulp. Percy gagged internally. This was the second time today his host had nearly caused him to throw up. Though he didn't say anything, curiously watching the changes unfold, Khasrith kept at it, devouring the withered body parts piece by piece, the gnarly chunks dissolving rapidly inside his stomach as the blue grew taller and stronger with each passing second. By the time he was done, he'd regained most of his missing height, only falling a few centimeters short. Scanning their surroundings, he made his way to the nearest corpse, repeating the process to recover the rest of his mass. Percy shuddered. Thankfully, the body had belonged to an adult, since he didn't think he could have stomached the sight of his host cannibalizing a dead child. Certainly not while sharing his senses. "I think I'm done watching you do this shit," Percy said, finally losing patience. "I kept my promise. It's time for you to pay." A flicker of protest rose in Khasrith's soul, but he stifled it quickly. "All right," the blue said. "I suppose it's time for my daily cleansing anyway." As fed up as Percy was with his host, he couldn't help but feel a sliver of excitement at the prospect of learning a Greater Springs cleansing technique. Strictly speaking, he was already using one of those, the modified version of the whirlpool of two streams that the Vault's researchers had somehow stolen from the Morai. However, it did nothing more than allow someone with two cores to cleanse both at the same time, saving a few valuable minutes per day. Percy had no idea what Khasrith's technique did, yet he didn't doubt it would be valuable. The blue reached for an emblem pinned to the upper left side of his tunic. Percy hadn't even noticed it before. It depicted the image of a coiled snake, a single fang jutting down from the right side of its mouth. The object was made of a dark mineral, countless dots glittering like stars along the edges. Dimensional marble? Percy guessed, recognizing the material. Sure enough, the moment his host touched the pin, a second object popped into existence inside his free hand. The spatial pin was clearly easier to use than the amulets they had on Remir, though it wasn't quite on par with the spatial seal Metatron had personally crafted for Percy. He had no idea how the pin's storage capacity compared, but he wouldn't be surprised if it fell somewhere between the two extremes. "Watch carefully because I'll only show you once," Khasrith said, snapping him out of his thoughts. Coiling his long tail a few times, the blue sat in the middle, tossing the object he'd extracted from the pin into his mouth. Percy barely caught a glimpse of the tiny, transparent pill, its volume only about half of an elixir's. This was quite surprising, since the dosage for core cleansing resources was generally fixed across worlds. After all, the mana cores of Sapience typically came in a standard size and could therefore endure about the same amount of beast mana during each session. Evidently, that didn't apply here. Keeping his thoughts to himself, Percy carefully observed his host's actions. Khasrith allowed his mana to mix with the dissolving pill inside his stomach, before drawing some of it back to his sternum. So far, he hadn't done anything out of the norm. It wasn't until the mana entered his core that the blue finally did something strange with it. Instead of allowing it to freely spread within the organ, he first compressed it into a tiny sphere in its center, before letting go. The cleansing mana slammed violently against the core's walls, making Percy fear that the organ would crack open like an egg. That didn't quite happen, at least not yet. But several tiny cracks did form along the crystalline walls, stinging as the beast mana seeped into them. What the hell? Is he trying to kill himself? Not that Percy cared about the man's well-being that much, but he'd rather not return to Remir so quickly. Luckily, His host appeared a lot more careful the next time he moved the beast mana to his sternum. He still didn't allow it to freely interact with the organ, but he didn't repeat his reckless approach from before either. Instead, he gathered a much smaller quantity of mana, sending it into the cracks with surgical accuracy. The beast mana gnawed at the walls of the cracks, causing them to widen and deepen, the burning sensation in Khasrith's sternum growing in intensity. The experienced blue didn't seem to care, however, sending one wave after another into the cracks. The cleansing session was over 15 minutes later. It wasn't that surprising considering the low dosage. Yet Percy felt like their core burned as much as it was supposed to, if not slightly more. Examining the organ carefully, he tried to wrap his mind around what his host had done. The first wave of beast mana had been way too forceful, but that seemed to have been on purpose. It had revealed the weaknesses, the impurities, in Khasrith's core. Those were exactly the spots that a mage needed to get rid of in order to strengthen their core over time. The following rounds had been gentler, but they had targeted the same spots far more accurately, causing the cracks to gradually expand in a very specific way. Khasrith had purged the weakest sections along the crystalline walls, leaving the rest of the organ intact. This story is posted elsewhere by the author. Help them out by reading the authentic version. Overall, the damage to the core wasn't any more severe than what a regular cleansing session would have accomplished. Percy guessed the cracks would still heal by tomorrow, reforging the inner layer of the organ stronger than ever. Only, the blue had achieved the same results while spending half the time and resources. This is the cascading cracks technique. I hope I don't have to explain why, Khasrith said. Percy nodded, pondering over the implications. His host had made it look easy, which wasn't all that surprising, considering the fact that Khasrith had probably been doing this once a day for centuries. However, Percy would have to practice a lot to master it, since the initial burst of pressure was exceedingly dangerous. Had Khasrith drawn a single additional drop of beast mana to his core, or unleashed the wave even a touch more forcefully, he could have seriously injured himself. Even if he hadn't, he could have easily delayed his subsequent recovery, missing tomorrow's session. On the flip side, if he'd used less power, he might have failed to reveal all the impurities. In that case, he wouldn't have targeted them later, which would have made the cleansing session less effective than normal. During the subsequent waves, things hadn't been nearly as dangerous, but concentrating the beast mana in so many spots was also quite a challenge. After all, the cracks were minuscule, nearly imperceptible, and there were dozens of them. Not to mention that controlling mana inside one's core was much harder than doing it externally, and the mana wasn't even solely Khasrith's, since it was mixed with the foreign beast mana contained in the pill. If Percy failed to control the mana properly, it could easily target the healthy sections of the organ, the ones that didn't need cleansing. The damage would still probably heal by the following day, so it wasn't inherently dangerous, but it would be a waste of the beast mana, eliminating the primary benefit of the technique. Still, if I can learn this, I'm going to save so many elixirs down the line, Percy thought, his borrowed heart skipping a beat. He and Mickey had already accumulated enough resources to last them 17 years, and that was without taking into account his brewing yield, which was bound to increase once he upgraded the cauldron and registered the new principle. The cascading cracks technique could theoretically allow him and his familiar to consume half as much Aurora Dew during each session, effectively doubling their stash. After all was said and done, it might last them for nearly 40 years. Well, that's assuming that the regeneration brought forth by the cyan powder doesn't interfere with it. I'll also have to modify it to work with my current technique, or I'll end up having to spend twice as long for both cores. Figuring the specifics out would take a lot of work, but the impact of this technique couldn't be overstated. Percy wasn't just thinking about himself, but Remir as a whole. Currently, his people only had enough elixirs for a fraction of the population. Unless they diluted them, of course. That number would drop even lower as soon as the secret of the Aurora Dew spread. This was one of the reasons why Percy hadn't been in a hurry to share the recipe with everyone. If things got handled poorly, a lot of people would suffer, redborns and orangeborns predominantly, but lots of yellowborns too. The cascading cracks technique wasn't enough to fix everything by itself, but it was a start. If Percy also taught his alchemic principles to the rest of the guild, helped everyone upgrade their cauldrons, and looked for more efficient ways of extracting nectar from the wasps alongside his new familiar, they would be that much closer to a complete solution. Still, do you take me for a fool? Percy suddenly asked, turning his attention back to his host. What do you mean? Casrith asked in response, clearly playing dumb. It's a useful technique, but you know damn well this isn't what I asked for. This is a greater spring, isn't it? How is your little trick going to accelerate my advancement speed or extend my lifespan? It won't. The blue shrugged. I'm sorry to break it to you, but the only reason we have so many gods is due to my bloodline. Every time we use it, it adds a few years to our lifespan. We've spread it to all the powerful sects, and our Titan's decree makes it easier for parents to pass their bloodlines down to their descendants. It's a real shame, but there's nothing I can do to help you. Casrith's words sounded sincere, but Percy had dealt with hundreds upon hundreds of hosts by now. He might not have his girlfriend's bloodline, but he still took pride in his ability to sniff out bullshit from a mile away. Try again with something more believable, he snarled. I've experienced enough advancements to tell that shedding your skin earlier didn't add a single day to your lifespan, let alone a few years. The blue's poorly concealed smirk froze on his face, his expression turning cold. Percy expected the man to lie again or try to renegotiate the terms of their agreement, but Casrith turned out to be even more shameless than he'd expected. Rather than honeyed words or offers of valuable resources, it was a wave of rejection that slammed into Percy's soul, forcefully unlodging him from many of his host's injuries. Remir's pull instantly strengthened, inadvertently helping the blue along. Casrith was trying to get rid of Percy. Good luck with that, you bastard, Percy yelled through their rapidly fading connection. Willing all the controlled preservation runes to deactivate, he instantly slowed his host's recovery speed to a crawl, but he didn't stop there. Percy's soul squirmed and shifted, over a dozen claws digging back into Casrith's injuries, carelessly ripping many of the stitches apart as he tried to grab hold of the blue. His host intensified the efforts to evict him, of course, but Percy wasn't having it. Countless spider-like limbs and long, flailing hairs sprouted along the surface of his wisp, allowing the claws to dig even deeper and to forcefully latch onto the blue's soul. I'm not going anywhere until you give me what I want, Percy said. Their connection had already weakened dramatically. It was like shouting through a wall, but he knew his host had heard him. Percy wouldn't have been as forceful if the blue had been more honest. There was a chance that the means Casrith's people used to extend their lifespan were genuinely difficult for Percy to obtain, but the blue could have just said that directly and made his case, instead of trying to stab him in the back. Either way, Casrith was clearly a piece of shit, so Percy didn't feel an ounce of regret over his actions. If anything, he felt quite pleased with himself for having had the foresight to prepare for this. Fine. Just stop trying to kill me, the blue hissed, his voice dripping with venom. The wave of rejection slamming against Percy weakened, though it didn't disappear completely. Part of it was instinctual, and it was pretty clear that his host didn't actually want him to stay. Regardless, this was workable. Burrowing back into the blue's injuries, Percy reactivated the enchantments. He'd been careful not to damage too many during the conflict, though the man's survival still hung by a thin thread. I'm warning you now so you don't come crying to me later. If you try this one more time, you're dead, Percy said, leaving no room for debate. Tell me how I can extend my lifespan, and don't even think about lying again. The blue clenched his fists in response to the threats, his soul boiling like a volcano about to erupt. But he swallowed whatever he was about to say, probably knowing he wasn't in a position to decline. I may have lied about my bloodline, but I genuinely meant it when I said I can't help you. The leaves we consume to extend our lifespan are limited. There aren't enough even for all of our yellowborns, let alone anyone else. There are long queues to obtain one. Percy grimaced. The main advantage of the cyan powder was that anyone with a pure affinity could learn to produce it. This pretty much guaranteed that every lesser spring could evolve into a greater spring, as long as they knew the secret. The last thing he needed was to depend on some obscure resource he couldn't even acquire on Remir. How often do you need to eat these leaves for them to work? Percy asked. Casritha's response filled him with hope. Just once in your lifetime. The effect is permanent. Once? Percy broke into sardonic laughter. On one hand, he was elated to hear that he only needed to get his hands on a single leaf to bring to his main body. On the other, the information only infuriated him further. And you thought you were better off lying to me and trying to screw me over instead of helping me get one? Casrith shook his head. It's not as simple as you make it sound. The tree produces fewer leaves each year than the number of new yellowborns. Our leaders are naturally quite peculiar about who gets them. Percy nodded inwardly, though he wasn't deterred in the slightest. All he heard was that there was a chance. He'd overcome much worse odds in the past. This story has been unlawfully obtained without the author's consent. Report any appearances on Amazon. This queue, is it just first come first served? Or are there other criteria? Having a good bloodline or a rare affinity moves you closer to the front. Bribing the people in charge works too, but that's beside the point. I already got mine when I was young. I can't ask for a second. Then find me someone who can, Percy insisted. I don't care who it is, or what they want in return. I'll find a way to make it worth their time. You'd better start treating this seriously, Casrith, because I'm not leaving your planet without a leaf. Percy hadn't told his host about the Morai decree yet, but there was no doubt it was worth more than the life extension resource. Casrith's people had already wasted one of their leaves on him, and he was someone with both a bloodline and a composite affinity. In other words, Percy had already preserved their investment merely by saving the Blue's life and even increased his value by giving him the seed of a new core. Casrith sighed in defeat. I'll have to ask my master. Percy shrugged, not giving a damn who his host had to talk to, as long as he got what he wanted. Drawing some metal mana out of his core, the Blue manifested a great sword taller and wider than he was, the oversized construct slamming into the ground with a heavy thud. Casrith wrapped his tail around the hilt a few times, leaning on the blade with his elbows before willing the weapon to shoot toward the clouds. Percy tried not to dwell on how disturbingly similar his host's method of flying was to his own, choosing to focus on more pressing matters. The ambient mana is so thick. He hadn't realized it earlier, but refilling his core here would take half the time it did on Remir. He didn't know if it was a property of the planet or a specialized decree cast by one of the local titans, but training and fighting would be incredibly convenient. It was a pity he couldn't stay, or take the ambient mana back with him. Another thing that stood out to Percy was the absurdly high altitude of the town they'd just left. The moment they took to the skies, he saw clouds everywhere, above, below, and around them. The town itself had been perched atop what at first seemed like a flat, rocky plain. No, an island. Its perfectly circular perimeter was bound by a steep cliff. A mountain? More like a stone pillar. Percy thought as the ruins receded behind them. It wasn't the only one either. More pillars loomed ahead, faint outlines piercing through the veil of clouds. They all shared the same narrow, cylindrical shape, but varied in height. Some vanished into a dense ceiling of mist above, their peaks way too far to make out. Others were even shorter than the one Percy and his host had left behind. As for their bases, they were too deep to see. Percy couldn't help but wonder what lay down there. Solid land? Or a vast body of water? It's an ocean, large enough to cover the whole planet, Casrith muttered, having clearly guessed his thoughts, though he sounded more annoyed than informative. Now, will you please stop gawking at everything? It's distracting. How do people below Blue travel from pillar to pillar if they can't fly? Percy asked, undeterred. He was going to get his free tour one way or another. Don't tell me they have to climb down, sail across, then scale the next one. That sounded wildly impractical. From what he could tell, most pillars were tens of kilometers apart and just as tall, if not taller. Casrith rolled his eyes. If two pillars are close enough, people build bridges. The major cities and sects have teleportation platforms. Some factions own flying vehicles for the lower grades, or hire Blues for escorts. But for the most part, Greens and below tend to stay put. Percy nodded, fascinated by what he was hearing. Teleportation platforms? Flying vehicles? Was this the norm in other Greater Springs too? These were things he would have expected from the vault, though the artificial world wasn't nearly large enough to require them in order to function properly. Evidently, the technology that other Peak factions possessed didn't lag as far behind Metatron's as Percy had originally thought. Kasrith wasn't the only blue flying in the area. Hundreds of others flitted through the clouds, each using a more ostentatious method than the last. One rode atop a glowing four-winged horse sculpted from pure mana. Another floated inside a sleek carriage powered by a lattice of colorful runes pulsing in unison across its wooden frame. It seemed that here, travel wasn't just about getting from place to place. It was a performance, a symbol of status. "You never told me where you're from," Kasrith suddenly said. "Nor will I," Percy replied. "Come on, what's the harm? This is Theskala. See how easy that was." Percy stifled a chuckle. His host had done an admirable job trying to mask his sinister intentions, but he clearly lacked experience in interacting with another's soul. "Do you take me for a fool? I thought I'd made it clear enough that I don't trust you any farther than I can throw you. Just shut up and fly to your master." Percy held all the leverage as long as the Blue's survival depended on him, but he clearly understood that he couldn't afford to as much as hint at his origin. This place, Theskala, could probably crush Remir with ease if he made a mistake. "It was worth a shot," Kasrith replied, not appearing to care in the slightest that his intentions had been seen through. "Don't think that threatening me will end well for you, country bumpkin." Percy grinned. "We'll see." Percy had more questions, but he didn't get a chance to voice them. Diving toward one of the shorter pillars jutting out of the clouds, his host landed on a less crowded spot near the edge, carelessly tossing the greatsword into the depths behind him. This place seemed to be some kind of teleportation hub, judging by the organized chaos of platforms scattered over its surface. They were sculpted from dimensional marble, each etched with ornate insignias mixing seamlessly with glowing runes. Kasrith slithered through the crowded summit, making his way toward the center of the pillar. There, Percy saw a platform depicting the image of a coiled serpent, a single fang descending from the right side of its gaping maw. Percy recognized it immediately as the same insignia that adorned his host's spatial pin. Seemingly remembering something, Kasrith paused just before he stepped onto the platform. Without a word, he opened his mouth and pinched his left fang, ripping it out with a sudden jerk. The pain tore through Percy like a jagged bolt, punching through his host's skull with the subtlety of a meteor strike as the taste of iron flooded their mouth. To his credit, Kasrith didn't so much as wince. "What the hell was that for?" Percy asked, trying to dam the pain behind a wall of mental effort. It wasn't easy, because 2 lines of blood trickled down the Blue's face, the first rolling down his chin, the other swallowed by his throat, offering Percy a constant reminder. At the same time, Percy recalled that the Blue's left fang had been missing when he first found him, at least until their molting regenerated it. Percy hadn't thought much of the missing fang, assuming it had been another of the many injuries Kasrith had sustained while massacring the villagers. Clearly, there was more to it than that. His host answered with a flicker of wry amusement. "The Broken Fang sect demands that new members rip out their left fang as tribute proof of loyalty and conviction. Naturally, healing it is easy, but doing so is frowned upon." The Blue finally stepped onto the enchanted platform, brushing his fingers across the pin on his tunic. The runes below his tail ignited in response, weaving a new constellation of light. Evidently, the spatial artifact was more than just a storage device. Then the world blinked. They reappeared on a second pillar, this one quieter with fewer teleportation platforms. But they all bore the same symbol this time, the one belonging to Kasrith's sect. There were fewer people too, all of them wearing the same style of clothes, a loose tunic draped over their shoulders, its color matching the grade of their cores. Most were blues, a few escorting greens. A solitary violet stood out, popping into existence atop a platform a few dozen meters away. Some blues wore noticeably finer clothes, their tunics embroidered with serpentine patterns that gleamed with violet silk, giving their attire a unique trim. Percy tilted his host's chin slightly in their direction. What's up with them? Stop that. Don't even look at those people. Do you want to get us both killed? Cassereth snapped at him with a silent hiss. Percy bit back the sarcastic retort at the tips of their forked tongue. He didn't really care about the Blues' survival, but he didn't want Cassereth to die before he got the life-extending leaf. As much as he hated his host's guts, Percy understood that he had to play nice until that happened. In the end, he remained silent until Cassereth reached the far edge of the pillar. Conjuring another great sword, the Blue took off again, disappearing into the haze above. Clearly, this place wasn't their destination, only a way station on the journey. I'm still waiting for an answer to my question, Percy said once it became clear his host had no intention of replying. Why do you even care about our clothes? You just want to get the leaf and go, don't you? Love what you're reading? Discover and support the author on the platform they originally published on. Percy rolled their eyes. I care, because you said that getting one wouldn't be easy. I need to understand your sect if I'm going to negotiate with your master. A sigh escaped Cassereth, sharp and resigned. The violet trim marks them as elite disciples. On paper, it means they can fight someone above their grade. The Blues' words gave Percy pause. Back on Remier, the idea of jumping grades was all but unheard of. At least until Percy came along. Some talented mages, like Rambert, Jason, or Galahad, did stand out among their peers, but only within the narrow confines of their own grade. Even somebody with a blessing and a bloodline couldn't easily bridge the gap to the next one. Perhaps it wasn't so strange that this place was different, though. It was a greater spring, after all. Thescala had more people, more gods, more of everything, really: decrees, bloodlines, blessings, ambient mana, advanced runecrafting, longer lifespans. It stood to reason that a few lucky individuals would be born with enough advantages to leap ahead. What do you mean, on paper? Percy asked, catching the caveat in his host's explanation. Fighting above one's grade is still quite uncommon. 9 out of 10 elite disciples earn their elevated status by having connections or flattering the right elder. Even so, I'd rather not mess with them. Percy nodded in understanding. As advanced as Thescala was, it appeared that corruption was a universal truth. What about other grades? Can they get trims too? Cassereth hovered for a moment, his eyes scanning the horizon before responding. Kind of. Most sects don't accept disciples below green. And greens obviously can't jump grades no matter how talented they are, because they don't have domains. So, really, you'll only see elite disciples among blues. Percy felt the urge to compare himself to the residents of the Greater Spring. It appeared that somebody like him, who could not only bridge a gap of 2 grades but also kill blues without having a domain, was a rarity even here. Not surprising, maybe, given all the advantages he'd woven into his arsenal over the years, but the thought still caused the corners of his borrowed lips to curl up. He wondered if the same was true for factions ranked even higher up the cosmic hierarchy, like the Morai or Sixiong. Either way, he couldn't help but picture himself in a yellow tunic with a blue trim, something he would have been eligible to wear if he lived here. It wasn't the most aesthetically pleasing combination of colors, but it was possibly one that no Thescalan had donned before. What about your violets or whites? Can't any of them fight against stronger opponents? Some can, Cassereth replied before elaborating. But they're no longer disciples. Regular violets, like my master, become sect elders. Those with a white trim are grand elders. Reaching white turns you into a deputy sect master. The strongest whites, the ones who can stand against demigods, get a golden trim. They get to compete for the sect master's seat. And your actual demigods? I've seen thousands of them scattered across the planet while searching for a body. Cassereth shrugged. They're called ancestors. Once somebody ascends to that level, they stop getting involved in mortal affairs. They aren't even allowed to help their sects unless they are defending against an invasion. They spend most of their time in seclusion trying to attain divinity. As for a trim, it's meaningless to them. None of them can fight a true god on their own anyway, nor do they care about past achievements or talent. At that level, there is only one thing that matters: you either become a god, forever etching your name onto our world's history, or you fail and end up forgotten. Percy mulled his host's words over. Aside from the sheer number of people at the higher grades that Thescala boasted, he was struck by how integrated they remained within their society. Unlike Remir, they didn't seem to corral all their wights and demigods into a special organization like the Divine Order, at least, not before they actually attained divinity. That was only to be expected. On a lesser spring, only the Greenborns could reach such heights. With so few of them, it made sense to gather and protect them to the very end. But on a greater spring, even Yellowborns could ascend to godhood, making it impractical to isolate them. The more sensible approach was to simply let everyone be, until they crossed the final threshold and shed their mortal coils. Kassereth came to an abrupt halt, snapping Percy out of his thoughts. Another pillar loomed ahead, tall enough to pierce the ceiling of fog. Unlike the others, its surface was pocked with holes that grew wider and farther apart toward the top. The ones near the bottom weren't very busy, but countless blues swarmed in and out like bees around the midsection, while violets did so higher up. "We're here," the blue said, angling toward a cavern relatively high up. Most of the people flying at that height were violets, so Percy assumed Kassereth was heading straight to his master's residence, and the man's next words confirmed that. "Oh, I should warn you, he has quite the temper. Let me do the talking." As soon as Kassereth stepped into the cavern leading toward his master's residence, Percy felt the ambient mana grow even thicker. The air outside had already been about twice as rich as Remir's, but it climbed by another 30 to 40% in here. It was a modest improvement, yet one that was bound to pay dividends if Percy spent years training in this environment. Is it because of the runes? He wondered, examining the colorful symbols shimmering along the walls and ceiling of the narrow corridor. This wasn't his first time coming across a large-scale mana-gathering array, but the one they had in the Alchemist's Guild couldn't compare in quality. Percy was tempted to ask his host to pause so that he could jolt the enchantments down on a piece of parchment to take back with him. But he knew there was no point. The runes would lose most of their power if he drew them without understanding the Thescalan language. Besides, the enchantments were incompatible with his own, and he could probably get better runes from the vault. "Let's leave it for now. It's not like I have a use for the array while my main body is on the run." Either way, Percy had more important things to worry about. Oblivious to his thoughts, Kassereth slithered through the dim tunnel, eventually reaching a vast hall. The temperature seemed to plummet the moment they entered, a dense mist lowering visibility. Deep inside the room, a single man sat atop his own coiled tail, meditating silently. To Percy, this person looked no different from the other male Thescalans he had seen on the way. Still, the man's violet core, matching tunic, and the passive aura of authority he radiated left no doubt as to his identity. If those things weren't enough, Kassereth sealed the deal by standing quietly by the entrance, not daring to make a sound without his master's permission. Percy was taken aback by that, not used to seeing his host so respectful. It didn't take long for him to understand why Kassereth was acting like this, however. Evidently, the elder was the type of person who left his disciples waiting. What wasn't as obvious was whether this was just the man's style, or if he was punishing his subordinate for something specific. It wasn't until about an hour later that the elder finally deigned to speak. "You're late," he said, slowly opening his eyes. They cut through the mist like ruby daggers, though the violet didn't even bother to turn his head, not sparing his disciple a single glance. Even so, Percy felt like he was being stared at by a hungry beast, the air freezing in his lungs. Meh, Baldy can probably beat this guy. Hell, I bet I'll be able to do that too. As soon as I reach green. Percy reassured himself to dispel some of his nervousness. Obviously, there were plenty of powerful violets on Thescala, capable of fighting above their grade. But this person wasn't one of them. Like Kassereth had said, his master's tunic was woven out of a plain violet fabric, lacking the characteristic trim of a grand elder. Percy's host still cupped his fists politely before responding. "I ran into trouble. The town had more blues than our intel suggested and..." Silence. The violet spat, the disappointment in his voice sending a chill down the Blue's spine. "I've no interest in your excuses. You are a trained disciple of the Broken Fang sect, sent to kill a bunch of nobodies. Can't you even accomplish that without issue?" I did. They're all dead. It just took me a little longer than expected," Kassereth said with a stammer, his agitation palpable. "A little longer?" The elder chuckled, though his eyes narrowed, devoid of humor. "How many times do I need to explain that your poor performance reflects badly on me? As a newly promoted elder, I'm only allowed up to 5 disciples. The number of missions you complete each month affects my ranking in the sect. Do you understand?" The elder's scathing words made Kassereth swallow hard. As for Percy, his feelings on the matter were mixed. On one hand, he didn't like his host. Leaving aside the fact that Kassereth had slaughtered a bunch of innocents, the bastard had even tried to double-cross him. So, part of him enjoyed watching him chastised by his master. On the other, he couldn't help but think that the Violet's treatment of his disciple was a little unfair. Percy's host had won against at least 2 blues, maybe more, as well as several greens. Even if the townsfolk had been untrained, Kassereth had to be stronger than most of the blues Percy had faced on Remier to have defeated so many opponents. Maybe he wasn't quite at the level of an elite disciple, but he was likely very close. "I guess they have higher standards than us." Unauthorized duplication. This narrative has been taken without consent. Report sightings. Kassereth clenched his fists, his soul boiling with indignation. But he didn't dare to show it. "I understand. It won't happen again." "Very well." The Violet nodded. "I've had the details of your next 2 assignments sent to your chamber. Go. I want them both completed in half the indicated time." Kassereth turned around, seemingly about to leave. Percy didn't let him, however. Upon realizing that his host couldn't summon the courage to reveal the true extent of his failure to his master, or negotiate on his behalf, he decided to take matters into his own hands. "Would you like a more useful disciple?" he asked, taking over the Blue's mouth. "What are you doing? Are you trying to get us killed?" Kassereth asked in shock. Percy ignored him. It was too late to debate this with his host anyway. His words had already caught the Violet's attention. The elder was staring at them in confusion, his brow creased. "Kassereth died during the mission," Percy explained. "He's only alive thanks to me. You don't look like you'd give a shit if he had stayed dead. But I might be able to do something to increase his value in your eyes." "Who are you?" the Violet finally asked, his curiosity clearly piqued. "You first. Kassereth never mentioned your name, and I'm not going to call you Master." The Violet didn't seem to take Percy's straightforwardness that well. A powerful domain descended upon him, slamming him face first into the cold floor. Perhaps they could have resisted the pressure somewhat if they had deployed their own domains. Though Kassereth clearly had no intention of defying his master, and Percy didn't want to pour more oil in the fire either. He could tell the Violet was only probing him. The elder could easily release more power if he wished to harm them. "Are you done?" Percy asked, his voice still as a lake. Kassereth wasn't nearly as calm, however. "Master, please hear the outsider out. He's stitched up my soul to keep me alive. He can kill me with a thought." Percy smirked upon listening to his host. Kassereth had spoken in a desperate, arguably even pathetic, tone, seemingly advocating Percy's case. In reality, that was just an act. The Blue had merely seized the opportunity to inform his master about Percy's abilities, probably hoping that the elder would save him. Regardless, Percy didn't much care about his host's ploys. He was still confident he could strike a deal with the Violet. "My name is Cyrneth. I take it you're here for Theskala's life extension method?" the elder asked, unperturbed by his disciple's words. His domain continued to press down on Percy and Kassereth with the weight of a mountain. "I'm Percy. I'd rather talk to you face to face," he replied, having no interest in conversing like this. The Violet shrugged, finally withdrawing his domain. "You're braver than my spineless disciple. I'll give you that. You'd better have more than that, though, if you wish to make a deal with me." "I'm indeed here for that leaf," Percy admitted. rolling his host's shoulders and stretching his arms. I can turn this sack of shit into one of those fancy elite disciples. Is that good enough? Oh, a spark of interest flared inside the violet's slit pupils. And how are you planning to accomplish that? That's my business, Percy replied noncommittedly. He wasn't ready to share any of his secrets with Cyrnith. He didn't know if the Elder had any sinister intentions toward him, but he hadn't forgotten that the Elder was the one who had sent Kassereth on that mission to massacre those people. But that wasn't the only reason he'd given the man a vague response. Frankly, Percy had yet to decide how to strengthen his host. He'd already passed the Morais decree to Kassereth, but the second core would be useless in the short term. The man was a Yellow-born, so the new organ would be 2 grades lower than his first one, providing him with a negligible boost. Circulation wasn't on the table either. Percy had no intention of sharing the boosting art with these people. Even if he did, tempering Kassereth's channels would take time. Suffice to say, Percy's options were rather limited. In any case, he could worry about delivering his end of the bargain after Cyrnith agreed to his terms. What do you say? Percy asked again. I imagine that having an elite disciple will look good on you. Percy felt his host's soul flare up with greed. Clearly, Kassereth was also interested in getting stronger. But nobody in the room cared about the Blue's opinion. It will, the Elder admitted before shaking his head. Yet, it's not enough to warrant the kind of reward you want. Our sect does get a few extra leaves per year, but they're highly sought after. Our Grand Elders and Deputy Sect Masters want to get one for their less talented descendants. The cost of getting involved in the conflict is too high. Noticing the Violet's phrasing, Percy couldn't help but smirk. The man hadn't declined outright. He was simply haggling for better terms. I don't care what you need to do. Just tell me what you want in return. The Violet smiled too. I like talking to someone smart. Kassereth will take the evaluation 10 days from now. Make sure he gets his trim. After that, you'll be eligible to enter the regional tournament. If you place in the top 16, I'll get you your leaf. I can do that, Percy replied, not having the slightest clue what this tournament involved. Worst case scenario, he could always leave and let Kassereth deal with the mess. Though I'm a bit surprised you're this open to getting me a leaf. I expected more resistance. Cyrnith didn't reply immediately. His forked tongue flickered a couple of times, his eyes scanning his disciple from head to tail, seemingly searching for something. Eventually, he gave up. That's because you don't know much about the leaves. They're valuable for sure, but each can only be used by a single person, so we don't really care if a couple leak outside Thescala. Percy nodded. He still had plenty of questions about both the leaf and the tournament, but he could ask Kassereth later. Returning control of the body to the Blue, he stifled a laugh as he watched Kassereth slither away in a hurry, seemingly unwilling to remain in the Violet's sight a moment longer than necessary. Yet Percy's amusement barely lasted a second. Remembering the steep terms he had just agreed to, he let out a sigh. 10 days. I need to find a way to make Kassereth a lot stronger by then. Have you any idea what you've done? Kassereth snapped once they were alone. He's going to gut us alive if you fail to deliver. Percy shrugged. No, just you, he can't get to my guts. So you'd better start training. And how the hell am I supposed to do that? You think I've been stuck at my current level for decades because I'm lazy? You tell me. How far exactly are you from a Violet strength? Kassereth sighed. Not very. I can already hold my own against 3 regular Blues. But the remaining gap is impossible to cross. I don't have a blessing and, while my bloodline is useful, it doesn't help in combat. I've only made it this far thanks to my composite affinity and sheer skill. Percy nodded, slightly impressed. Composite affinities were indeed superior to the common elements, thanks to their versatility and raw power, but the difference wasn't that large. Tripling one's fighting strength relying on nothing but that took real talent. Maybe Kassereth wouldn't even lose to Galahad, at least. Not until Percy's uncle used his boosting art. Show me, Percy said. Do you have a place we can practice? His host summoned another greatsword and took off without a word. This time, he flew straight upward, ignoring the countless caves lining the pillar's sides, shooting directly toward the ceiling of fog. The air grew colder the higher up they climbed. Thinner too, making it harder to breathe or replenish their mana, though Kassereth appeared unbothered. When they burst through the clouds, Percy gasped. It was his first time seeing Thescala's clear blue sky. A golden sun blazed overhead, sitting at its apex. Only the tallest of the heaven-piercing pillars reached this high, including the cylindrical mountain belonging to Kassereth's sect. They landed near the edge of the summit. Others were here, but very few of them were people. Colossal beasts roamed the plateau, the mere sight of them causing Percy's eyes to widen. Each was easily the size of a small house, even while on all fours. Dark scales shimmered like obsidian daggers along their bodies, painting a stark contrast against the milky white skin of the Thescalans. The beasts looked like reptiles, though their heavy frames were built closer to a buffalo's, complete with a pair of horns that curved upwards. Blue beasts, the first Percy had ever seen. Even stranger, the creatures weren't rampaging, as he might have expected. Some lounged on the ground, others strolling around leisurely, each thunderous step sending a tremor through the plain. But they weren't attacking. Or, well, a few were, but they only seemed to clash against a blue or violet Thescalan in single combat, clearly engaged in something closer to a friendly spar than a true fight to the death. How is this possible? Not just on Remir, but practically everywhere Percy had been, beasts above red, let alone blue, were considered untamable. That was one of the primary reasons Mickey's existence had caused such a stir back home. Magical beasts grow hungrier and more violent with each promotion, but also smarter, Kassereth explained. Blue is a bit of a sweet spot. By then, they're intelligent enough to know what's good for them. Percy nodded slowly. That tracked. From the countless beasts he'd killed in the Thirsty Valley and on Melodia, he knew that greens were still too dumb. They understood fear and strength, yet struggled to resist their hunger or put down their pride, often throwing themselves to their death as a result. On the flip side, beasts above blue were as intelligent as sapients, so they didn't have much trouble controlling themselves. Creatures that strong faced a different problem. However, they simply needed way too much food to sustain themselves, which prevented them from coexisting peacefully with others. I guess that only a greater spring has both the resources to feed so many blue beasts and the strength to keep them in line, Percy realized. Support creative writers by reading their stories on Novelbin, not stolen versions. Raising one or two on Remir might not be impossible, but it wouldn't be worth the cost. Most noble houses only had a handful of blues, so handling the monsters would drain more manpower than it provided. Oblivious to his thoughts, Kassereth slithered toward the nearest lizard. The creature appeared even more terrifying up close. The man barely reached the midpoint of the beast's forelimbs. The creature tilted its head to look at them hungrily, sticky rivers of saliva gushing between its massive fangs, forming wide pools after splashing on the ground. Don't worry, it won't attack unless we hit it first. They're here to serve as our sparring partners. Besides, I'm strong enough to handle it, the blue said after seeing Percy remain silent for so long. It wasn't fear that had left Percy stunned, however. Gazing up at the towering abomination, he couldn't help but think back to his familiar. Was Mickey going to grow this large after his next advancement? Percy had always known this, of course, but actually seeing a blue beast in person just hit differently. Mickey was already hard to fit in places built for people. Was the crow doomed to spend the rest of his new life hiding in the wilderness, exiled from civilization? The Starry Queen, whose egg I'm planning to steal, has to be even larger than these things, Percy reminded himself, swallowing hard. He suddenly felt a lot less confident in his plan to provoke such a monster. But he shook the distracting thoughts away. Now wasn't the time to dwell on his familiars. He had less than 2 weeks to turn his host into an elite disciple, or he could kiss the life-extending leaf goodbye. All right, Percy said, turning his attention back to the blue. Show me what you've got. Kassereth didn't hesitate. He unleashed his domain, the beast responding in kind. The collision of the two waves sent the air between them in turmoil. Barely any of the creature's willpower reached Kassereth's body. but it was enough to give Percy a feel. He didn't have his mutated eyes to examine its flow carefully, though he still managed to glimpse some information. The domain felt rowdy, almost erratic, as if each strand had its own will, barely submitting to its owner's control. Percy felt itchy, as if his host's body had been immersed in a sea of ants trying to eat their way through his scales. How bizarre! It was impressive that the creature had learned to incorporate properties of its affinity into its domain. Not every blue sapient was capable of that, let alone an oversized animal. But the beast didn't give him a chance to think too hard about it. The monster moved with shocking speed, reaching them in an instant. It tried to stomp on Kassereth, the man barely leaping back in time to avoid getting flattened. At the same time, an ocean of liquid metal gushed out of his pores. It surrounded him like a tide, enveloping him in an opaque blob of silver. Percy's surroundings went dark as a result. Neither his eyes nor his mana sense could peer through his host's construct, and he didn't have enough phantom mana to activate soul vision either. Left with no other choice, he unfolded his own domain, using it to feel his way through the mana. That said, he didn't rush to aid his host just yet, still intent on evaluating Kassereth's performance. The beast charged again. Kassereth twisted the makeshift shell into a solid spring, launching himself into the air. A great sword formed beneath his tail once he was high enough, turning into a floating platform. Hovering several dozen meters above the pillar, he watched the beast below. Neither moved. The lizard could probably reach him if it jumped, but it probably understood it didn't stand a chance of catching him in the air like this. I see. So blue beasts are at a severe disadvantage against mages of the same grade, unless they have wings. They were too large and too heavy. Unlike sapients, they didn't have a way to fly using their mana either. This was another barrier standing between them and the pinnacle of magic. Perhaps their domains would grow powerful and stable enough to solve the problem at Violet or White, though Percy wasn't sure. Luckily, neither Mickey nor the Starry Wasps had to worry about this. Nor did Kassereth. More mana spilled out of the Thescalen's body, coalescing into hundreds of long swords that floated beside him in an orderly manner. Their sharp edges glinted under the sunlight, their smooth blades reflecting the blue sky and the roiling sea of clouds in the distance. As for their tips, they were all pointing directly at the poor beast. With no warning, the weapons shot forward in unison. The monster roared as its hide was peppered with steel, broken scales flying left and right, blood pooling beneath its bulk. But it didn't fall. It didn't even buckle. The swords had barely pierced a few centimeters into its thick hide. Growling in pain, the beast glared at Kassereth with burning eyes, seemingly daring him to descend. Its domain surged for a moment, pushing against the Thescalens, though it didn't get far. I'm not allowed to injure it too seriously, so I'll only show you one more attack, Kassereth said. Not waiting for a response, the blue prepared a second wave of swords. Less than a third of his reserves remained by the time he was done, twice as many constructs floating beside him. But he didn't stop there. The sky lit up in a flash of indigo, sparks of the same color crackling along the blades. They began to vibrate, the metal glowing red, then white-hot. Percy could practically taste the heat with every flicker of his host's forked tongue, as the scent of ozone filled the air. This is the best I can do right now, Kassereth said. It's probably not enough to injure a Violet, but I bet I can force them to take a step back. Then he let go. Apocalyptic. That was the best word to describe Kassereth's attack. Countless glowing blades pelted the ground with the speed of lightning bolts, leaving trails of twisted air still crackling with electricity in their wake. The constructs shattered on impact, flashes of light, booming shockwaves, and tiny shrapnel flying everywhere. By the time the blue had exhausted the last drop of mana from his core, a cascade of deep craters and broken stones surrounded the beast. Numerous still intact runes lit up around the devastated area, however, slowly putting everything back together. The creature had only survived due to Kassereth's restraint. Over 90% of his attacks had intentionally missed their mark. The few that hadn't had inflicted some debilitating injuries, a severed forelimb, a broken horn and 3 deep holes in the beast's torso, the nearby flesh too scorched to bleed. The sex healers or animal handlers, or whoever was responsible for the monsters, clearly had their work cut out for them. Either way, Percy didn't care about the beast as much as he did about his host's fighting strength. Not bad. I'm not sure I would have survived this with my main body. In terms of raw firepower, the spell definitely bordered the next grade. Sadly, a single use had exhausted the blue's reserves and might not be enough to take a violet down. Casrith would be screwed if he unleashed this kind of attack and failed to end the fight with it. Percy already had some thoughts on how to help, but he wanted to evaluate the rest of his host's abilities before suggesting a training plan. Landing back on the platform, Casrith took some time to refill his core. The beast didn't attack him again, probably realizing that their little bout was over, though it did toss them a hateful glare every now and then. Once the blue had recovered, Percy asked him to demonstrate the rest of his skills. Casrith clicked his tongue in irritation but ultimately complied. He probably understood that Percy was the only one who could save him from his master's disappointment. It soon became clear that Casrith preferred to maneuver in battle atop the same greatsword he used for long-distance travel. The moment he stopped conserving his mana, Percy's host turned faster than most of the blues he had faced on Remir. Provoking another beast and flying within reach, Casrith also showed Percy his defensive capabilities. Whenever he was about to get hit, he allowed a layer of liquid metal to gush out of his pores, mixing it with his domain to cover his body. This was one of the areas where Casrith's affinity excelled. Its defensive power didn't lose to earth mana, but it was quicker and far more versatile than the common affinity. As an added bonus, it appeared that Casrith could reshape the substance into an attack at a moment's notice, something that even Percy's reinforced mana couldn't do. After watching everything, Percy nodded thoughtfully. Admittedly, Casrith's fighting style was disturbingly similar to his own. Didn't he also move and attack mainly by relying on a flock of flying weapons? Granted, there were a few differences. Percy could only control and maintain so many constructs due to the special properties of his soul affinity and the increased mana regeneration afforded to him by his boosting art. Meanwhile, Casrith had raw power and control brought about by his higher grade, as well as centuries of experience to lean back on. Comparing himself to the creep wasn't pleasant, but Percy did have a few ideas on how he could help the blue grow stronger. I can lend you a second domain while inhabiting your body. It won't be as good as yours, but it'll catch your opponents by surprise. It'll help, Casrith agreed, but did so with a frown. He didn't seem particularly happy with a temporary upgrade that would disappear the moment Percy left. Still, their priority was to get through the evaluation and the subsequent tournament. Besides, Casrith didn't know this yet, but he could awaken his second core and reach blue with it after a few decades of cleansing. That ought to bridge the remaining gap and truly give him the strength of an elite disciple. Of course, Percy hadn't brought this up yet. He didn't much like his host, and this wouldn't help them in the short term, so he had decided to let the man figure it out on his own later, assuming he survived the next few weeks. "What else have you got?" the blue asked, oblivious to Percy's thoughts. "The domain might get me through the evaluation and the first round of the tournament if we use it well, but our next opponents will be stronger and aware of it." Percy sighed, knowing that Casrith was right. The problem was that most of his other advantages weren't applicable here. Leaving aside the absence of the second core, the boosting art and his mutated eyes, he didn't even have enough phantom mana to fuel his spells. That only left his spectral traits, alchemy, and runecrafting. "Are you allowed external resources? Potions? Enchanted items?" he asked, some hope finding its way into his voice. "I might be able to brew you a little boost if you get me some good ingredients. I can also upgrade your swords if we have some time to prepare. Stolen novel. Please report." Percy hadn't registered the compression principle yet, but 10 days might be enough. This was more of a last resort, but a few doses of Troll's Fury potion could save them in a pinch, assuming he could brew at least a green equivalent of that. Runecrafting was even more reliable, Casrith's affinity practically being perfect for it. A few hardness and sharpness enchantments would greatly elevate the lethality of the blue swords, and Percy wouldn't even need any external materials to make this happen. To Percy's dismay, however, Cassereth shot both ideas down with a shake of his head. We're allowed nothing but plain clothes during the evaluation. Same rules for the tournament. Percy felt the urge to swear. Why? Isn't that unfair to people skilled in runecrafting or alchemy? Cassereth shrugged. Neither of those things is considered effective enough when fighting others at your grade. Realistically, they would only make a difference if you had somebody much stronger, like a wight or a demigod, prepare high-level equipment for you. The organizers have decided that it's simpler to just ban external means altogether than to monitor all the fighters for several days leading up to the competition to make sure they crafted everything by themselves. Once again, the Blue's words reminded Percy of how potent the Vault's Magiscript was. Evidently, enchanting one's constructs for use in battle was viewed as impractical even on a greater spring. The Thescalans didn't seem to have discovered the compression principle to improve their potions either. How annoying! He couldn't find a fault with the logic behind those rules, but they did inconvenience him greatly. After all, he was certain that his enchantments were powerful enough to matter. It's such a pity that I can't draw them on the fly. He paused, creasing his brow. Or can I? He wondered, a new idea suddenly taking root. Percy almost dismissed it out of hand, thinking it was too preposterous to even entertain. But the more he considered it, the more he realized he couldn't find any flaws with it. Instinctively, he summoned his status again, his gaze lingering on his trait's description for a long moment. Undersir. Ascribing boosts one's proclivity in expressing meaning onto any written medium. Undersir. Any written medium, he read, suddenly feeling a lot more confident about this. Zoras did say that it encompasses everything: paint, ink, chalk, carvings, mana. What about willpower? Could this actually work? Well, there was only one way to know for sure. Cassereth. Create one of your swords. I want to try something. The Blue complied, a splash of silver manifesting in his palm, soon reshaping itself into a fine long sword. Percy didn't say anything. He examined the construct for a few minutes, occasionally swinging it and gauging its weight and sharpness. It was definitely stronger and harder than anything he could forge out of his own mana, at least before drawing any runes on either. Then again, the two materials were separated by just as many grades. And while Cassereth's steel constructs were easier to create and reshape, Percy doubted they could be given a form that was simultaneously as strong and flexible as his magical silk. Regardless, that wasn't important. He wasn't going to fight the man anytime soon. Lifting the sword up, Percy began to carve a rune onto its flat surface. Only, he didn't bother to pull any additional mana from his host's core, like he usually did when drawing his own enchantments. There was no need, since the weapon was already made of mana, and the material was malleable enough to be reshaped freely without losing its structural integrity. Instead, Percy used something else to carve the symbol, his domain. A sliver of willpower gathered to the tips of his borrowed fingers, cutting smooth lines into the magical steel. He didn't think willpower could be used to fuel the enchantments. It would fizzle out the moment he stopped concentrating. The runes still had to be powered solely by Cassereth's mana. However, Percy's control over the domain would give him an excellent tool to draw the symbols, one that he hoped could be used in a vastly different way to what he usually did. A few seconds later, the sharpness rune was complete. The enchantment was laughably simple, so the effort hadn't even woken up the spectral fiend hiding within Percy's soul. That was fine for now. The creature was bound to wake up sooner or later, since what Percy had in mind was going to be a great deal more challenging. But he had to make sure the enchantment worked when drawn like this before trying anything else. "Can you check whether the sword is any sharper?" he asked, giving control back to Cassereth. The man swung the weapon a few times before slashing at the ground. He even made sure to strike with the part of the edge closest to the rune to hopefully maximize its effect. Percy did think that the construct had dug a little deeper than expected, though he waited for his host to confirm it, the Blue being a lot more familiar with his own spells. It definitely did something, though the difference was barely worth mentioning. Percy nodded, not that surprised to hear that a single sharpness rune hadn't changed much. But this was still good news, proof that his idea had merit. Holding the long sword up again, he gathered some more of his willpower, yet he didn't rush to draw another rune. This time he didn't even lift a finger. Instead, he allowed the domain to coalesce into a dense sphere, floating right next to the weapon. Picturing the sharpness rune in his mind, he allowed the willpower to slowly shift, reshaping itself into an intricate symbol. It was hard, because the substance was invisible, and even a blue's control of their domain wasn't sufficient for such a delicate task. Not by itself, at least. Struggling to whip the willpower into the correct shape, Percy felt something stir inside his soul, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips as a result. The scribing trait's influence soon spread over him, a new set of instincts now aiding him in his difficult task. Before, he had wielded the domain with all the sloppiness befitting an amateur who had barely spent a few months borrowing a blue's body. Yet, in just an instant, the substance seemed to fall in line, turning into an exact replica of the image in his mind. As soon as he felt happy with the result, he slammed the tiny domain against the blade, letting the mana split beneath the willpower as he focused on the enchantment's intended effect. Seeing the shallow dent located a few centimeters below the previous rune, its shape identical to the first, Percy's grin widened. He was about to ask his host to test it again, when his status beat him to the punch. Congratulations! You have mastered a new spell. Spectral art. Instantaneous imprint, refined. Wow! It looks like there's more I can accomplish with my traits than I originally thought. It wasn't like Percy had slacked back home. He had already incorporated his new ability into his runecrafting, elevating it to the next level. As soon as his clone had returned from Twilight City, his main body had quickly upgraded his superior runic grid, the refined spell he had developed with Nesh's help, into a masterful spectral art. He hadn't added any new enchantments, largely because he didn't know any. He hadn't been in a rush to return to the vault and buy more either. However, he had managed to shrink the palm-sized, clover-shaped unit cells further. Their current iteration was small enough to fit on a fingernail, meaning that he could probably include more than 10,000 of them on a single layer of his new armor, once he finished crafting it. Since the eventual piece of enchanted cloth was bound to contain multiple layers, and due to each unit cell involving 18 runes, the final construct would probably include over 1 million runes in total. It was a daunting project, requiring him to find the right balance between his two traits, a goal that Percy's main body was still working on. Changing his approach slightly, he had decided to spin the silk directly into an enchanted fabric, as it was the only way to preserve the material long enough to reach the end. That said, the fundamental way in which he drew the runes hadn't changed. Whether he carved them into his reinforced mana or wove them out of the gray silk, Percy had always prepared the enchantments slowly, putting great care into every single line, every stroke of his runes. Speed and simplicity had never been a priority, because he usually had as much time as he needed to prepare his constructs before a fight. Well, I suppose not having a domain didn't make things easier for me in the past, he reminded himself. He couldn't wield his mana with as much finesse as he could his willpower in a blue body, so stamping finished enchantments into his constructs would have been nothing but a pipe dream. "Color me impressed," Kasserith suddenly said, snapping Percy out of his thoughts. "I won't ask you how you've accomplished this, but it's still not enough. A couple of runes won't make a difference. Hell, even if you cover the sword in enchantments, a single weapon can't get us through the tournament." Percy nodded, his brain already racing at 100 miles an hour as he considered how to best leverage his new spell. The most powerful enchantment he could currently produce was naturally his supreme runic matrix. Unfortunately, even with the ability to imprint a rune, or a bunch of them, in an instant, it would take him several hours to enchant a single sword. There was no way an opponent would give them that long, certainly not one as powerful as a violet. "I'll have to simplify the unit cell a lot, and draw much fewer of them." His host didn't need concealment runes. His metal mana couldn't turn invisible anyway, and all of their opponents would be skilled at using their domains. Adaptation runes weren't necessary either, since they weren't planning to use any mana types other than Kasrith's. Finally, Percy could probably ditch the preservation runes too. He'd have to destroy all the constructs at the end of each battle anyway, to reduce the risk of somebody recognizing the vault's language. Kasrith hadn't said anything about it, but Percy didn't know if the spectators at the tournament would be more knowledgeable. This was a greater spring, after all. In any case, all of Percy's other runes would be useful here. The sharpness, lightness, and structural integrity enchantments were the key to improving the constructs, the whole point of this project. The controlled self-repair enchantments were also indispensable, as Percy and Kasrith would be relying on them to replicate their empowered weapons. That way, Percy would only have to enchant a single sword, and that would instantly give them the means to produce 100 of them. Actually, I might only need a piece of a sword, he realized. Once again, he was being led astray by his preconceived notions. He was used to his own reinforced mana, which was much more difficult to work with. Percy had to give it the right shape before enchanting it, and he couldn't easily alter it afterwards. But Kasrith's mana was a lot more uniform and malleable. In theory, Percy should be able to draw a few unit cells on a piece of the blade, using the self-repair enchantments to create more copies. Then, he could deactivate the enchantments to reset their memory, turn the edges of the fragments liquid to fuse them together, tweak the lump of metal into a proper sword, and then reactivate the runes to memorize the new shape. This tale has been unlawfully lifted from Novelbin. If you spot it on Amazon, please report it. I might be able to draw a somewhat dense grid after all. It wouldn't be nearly as dense as what he was trying to do with his silk, but he could still fit dozens of unit cells on each construct. The sharpness, lightness, and structural integrity enchantments would be fine without control runes too. So each unit cell would only need a total of 8 runes, fewer than half of the original. That should make them even easier for Percy to prepare in real time. The only downside was that they wouldn't be able to fuel the swords out of ambient mana without the carnival. Kasrith would have to manually pour mana from his own core into the weapons every time he wanted to repair or replicate them. It wasn't ideal, but it was more than manageable. I can do this in stages. There's no reason to draw all the unit cells at once. Percy could probably prepare a coarse grid within 20 to 30 seconds, giving Kasrith a template to use for a few minutes. At the same time, Percy could slowly fill in the gaps with even more runes, passing his host progressively stronger versions of the longsword in regular intervals. Once he couldn't improve them any further, Percy would be free to jump into the fight with his domain, giving the blue one final trump card. Having to slowly build up power over the course of the battle wasn't great, especially while getting besieged by a violet-level mage. However, it was already a miracle Percy had found a method to strengthen his host in such a short time, and with his hands practically tied behind his back. He doubted he'd find another. It sounds promising, Kasrith admitted after listening to Percy's explanation. If the runes are as potent as you claim, the elder in charge of the evaluation might give us the trim. But I'm more worried about the tournament. I don't know if our opponents will give us a chance to prepare, especially after they learn about the runes. We'll figure it out. Try to win the first battle with that attack you showed me earlier. We won't reveal our second domain until the next fight, and we'll hide the runes until the one after. Then, I guess you'll just have to keep your distance from them to buy time for me. Admittedly, this wasn't the best plan, but Kasrith was faster than most blues. Percy hoped that would be enough. What's the deal with that tournament anyway? Why does your master want you to participate so badly? These regional tournaments are pretty important for my people. There are generous rewards for every victory, for both the participants and their sections. It's also a great way to gain fame and prestige. Percy perked up. This sounded like a bigger deal than he'd initially thought. Do we have to compete against mages from all over Thescala, though? How does Cyrnith expect us to make the top 16? It'll be really tough, but not impossible, Kasrith said before elaborating. The competitions are segregated by grade, so we'll only have to fight against other blues. We have over 1 million of those on our world, but only about 50,000 are elite disciples. And only 1/10 of them are truly deserving of their status. The rest won't even consider joining. Percy swallowed hard. He wasn't sure if they even had 5,000 regular blues on Remier, let alone ones capable of fighting violets. Not to mention that Thescala had over 100,000 actual violets. But his host wasn't done. The good news is that they're not all competing at the same venue. There are 10 regional tournaments happening at the same time, so we'll only have to deal with 500 elite disciples at most. Not even that, in fact, since many are training in seclusion, are out on missions or otherwise occupied. It's an elimination-style tournament, so there will only be a total of 8 rounds if we're lucky, and we'll make the top 16 if we win 4 times in a row. Percy frowned. Their odds weren't terrible, but defeating the equivalent of 4 violets wasn't going to be easy. That bastard. Was that why he was smirking? He wondered, thinking back to Cernith's expression. The violet had set him up, probably not expecting him to meet his demands. Either way, Cernith and Kasserith had nothing to lose. As long as Percy got his host a trim and won a couple of rounds in the tournament, the Broken Fang sect would get showered in rewards, as would the Blues Master. As for Percy reaching the top 16 and earning himself a leaf, even on the off chance he succeeded, the rewards the violet would earn would probably be more valuable than the life-extending consumable. However, the elder had gravely miscalculated. For one, Percy had no intention of leaving Thescala empty-handed. So what if he got eliminated early? He'd stick around and look for another way to get what he wanted. Besides, the idea of earning a valuable reward after every victory filled him with greed. Top 16? What a joke. I'll win this thing if I can. 8 rounds meant 8 rewards. Of course, Percy had already benefited from this trip. Leaving the leaf aside, just his new spell and the cleansing technique his host had shown him would already help a lot down the line. But if he played his cards right, participating in this tournament might be one of his most profitable ventures yet. There was a good chance Kasserith would try and hoard the rewards, but whether Percy would let him keep anything would ultimately depend on how useful the prizes were for him. Can you stop daydreaming about the tournament? The Blue asked in annoyance. We haven't even passed the evaluation yet. Are you sure you can get this spell, the one you've literally just invented, into a usable state in the next 10 days? Percy shrugged. Have I mentioned that we don't need to sleep?